Part 3. What if not Pakistan? Having stated the Muslim case for Pakistan and the Hindus' case against it, it is necessary to turn to the alternatives to Pakistan, if there be any. In forming one's judgment on Pakistan, one must take into account the alternatives to it. Either there is no alternative to Pakistan, or there is an alternative to Pakistan, but it is worse than Pakistan. Thirdly, one must also take into consideration what would be the consequences if neither Pakistan nor its alternative is found acceptable to the parties concerned. The relevant data having a bearing on these points are presented in this part under these heads. 1. Hindu alternative to Pakistan. 2. Muslim alternative to Pakistan. 3. Lessons from abroad. Part 3. Mr. Savarkar is quite unconcerned about the Muslim reaction to his scheme. He formulates his scheme and throws it in the face of the Muslims with the covering letter, "Take it or leave it." He is not perturbed by the Muslim refusal to join in the struggle for Swaraj. He is quite conscious of the strength of the Hindus and the Hindu Mahasabha, and proposes to carry on the struggle in the confident hope that alone and unaided the Hindus will be able to wrest Swaraj from the British. Mr. Savarkar is quite prepared to say to the Musalmans, inverted comma begins, "If you come, with you; if you don't, without you; and if you oppose, in spite of you, the Hindus will continue to fight for their national freedom as best as they can." Inverted comma closed. Not so Mr. Gandhi. At the very commencement of his career as a political leader of India, when Mr. Gandhi startled the people of India by his promise to win Swaraj within 6 months, Mr. Gandhi said that he could perform the miracle only if certain conditions were fulfilled. One of these conditions was the achievement of Hindu-Muslim unity. Mr. Gandhi is never tired of saying that there is no Swaraj without Hindu-Muslim unity. Mr. Gandhi did not merely make this slogan the currency of Indian politics, but he has strenuously worked to bring it about. Mr. Gandhi, it may be said, began his career as a political leader of India with the manifesto dated 2nd March 1919, declaring his intention to launch Satyagraha against the Rowlatt Act and asking those who desired to join him to sign the Satyagraha pledge. That campaign of Satyagraha was a short-lived campaign and was suspended by Mr. Gandhi on 18th April 1919. As a part of his program, Mr. Gandhi had fixed the 6th March 1919 to be observed all over India as a day of protest against the Rowlatt Act. Reference to see his manifesto dated 23rd March 1919. Reference over. Mass meetings were to be held on that day, and Mr. Gandhi had prescribed that the masses attending the meetings should take a vow in these terms. Inverted comma begins, "With God as witness, we Hindus and Mohammedans declare that we shall behave towards one another as children of the same parents, that we shall have no differences, that the sorrows of each shall be the sorrows of the other, and that each shall help the other in removing them. We shall respect each other's religion and religious feelings, and shall not stand in the way of our respective religious practices. We shall always refrain from violence to each other in the name of religion." Inverted comma closed. There was nothing in the campaign of Satyagraha against the Rowlatt Act which could have led to any clash between the Hindus and Muslims. Yet Mr. Gandhi asked his followers to take the vow. This shows how insistent he was from the very beginning upon Hindu-Muslim unity. The Mohammedans started the Khilafat movement in 1919. The objective of the movement was twofold: to preserve the Khilafat and to maintain the integrity of the Turkish Empire. Both these objectives were unsupportable. The Khilafat could not be saved simply because the Turks, in whose interest this agitation was carried on, did not want the Sultan. They wanted a republic, and it was quite unjustifiable to compel the Turks to keep Turkey a monarchy when they wanted to convert it into a republic. It was not open to insist upon the integrity of the Turkish Empire because it meant the perpetual subjection of the different nationalities to the Turkish rule, and particularly of the Arabs, especially when it was agreed on all hands that the doctrine of self-determination should be made the basis of the peace settlement. The movement was started by the Mohammedans. It was taken up by Mr. Gandhi with a tenacity and faith which must have surprised many Mohammedans themselves. There were many people who doubted the ethical basis of the Khilafat movement and tried to dissuade Mr. Gandhi from taking any part in a movement the ethical basis of which was so questionable. But Mr. Gandhi had so completely persuaded himself of the justice of the Khilafat agitation that he refused to yield to their advice. Time and again he argued that the cause was just and it was his duty to join it. The position taken up by him may be summed up in his own words. Reference to Young India, 2nd June 1920. Inverted comma begins. 1. In my opinion, the Turkish claim is not only not immoral and unjust, but it is highly equitable, only because Turkey wants to retain what is her own, and the Mohammedan Manifesto has definitely declared that whatever guarantee may be necessary to be taken for the protection of the non-Muslims and non-Turkish races should be taken so as to give the Christian theirs and the Arabs their self-government under the Turkish suzerainty. 2. I do not believe the Turk to be weak, incapable or cruel. He is certainly disorganized and probably without good generalship. The argument of weakness, incapacity and cruelty one often hears quoted in connection with those from whom power is sought to be taken away. About the alleged massacres, a proper commission has been asked for, but never granted. And in any case, security can be taken against oppression. 3. I have already stated that if I were not interested in the Indian Mohammedans, I would not interest myself in the welfare of the Turks any more than I am in that of the Austrians or the Poles. But I am bound as an Indian to share the sufferings and trials of fellow Indians. If I deem the Mohammedan to be my brother, it is my duty to help him in this hour of peril to the best of my ability, if his cause commends itself to me as just. 4. The fourth refers to the extent Hindus should join hands with the Mohammedans. It is therefore a matter of feeling and opinion. It is expedient to suffer for my Mohammedan brother to the utmost in a just cause, and I should therefore travel with him along the whole road so long as the means employed by him are as honorable as his end. I cannot regulate the Mohammedan feeling. I must accept his statement that the Khilafat is with him a religious question in the sense that it binds him to reach the goal even at the cost of his own life, inverted comma, closed. Mr. Gandhi not only agreed with the Muslims in the Khilafat cause, but acted as their guide and their friend. The part played by Mr. Gandhi in the Khilafat agitation and the connection between the Khilafat agitation and the non-cooperation movement has become obscure by the reason of the fact that most people believed that it was the Congress which initiated the non-cooperation movement, and it was done as a means for winning Swaraj. That such a view should prevail is quite understandable because most people content themselves with noting the connection between the non-cooperation movement and the special session of the Congress held at Calcutta on 7th and 8th September 1920. But anyone who cares to go behind September 1920 and examine the situation as it then stood will find that this view is not true. The truth is that the non-cooperation has its origin in the Khilafat agitation and not in the Congress movement for Swaraj, that it was started by the Khilafatists to help Turkey and adopted by the Congress only to help the Khilafatists, that Swaraj was not its primary object, but its primary object was Khilafat, and that Swaraj was added as a secondary object to induce the Hindus to join. It will be evident from these facts. The Khilafat movement may be said to have begun on 27th October 1919, when the day was observed as the Khilafat Day all over India. On 23rd November 1919, the first Khilafat conference met at Delhi. It was at this session that the Muslims considered the feasibility of non-cooperation as a means of compelling the British government to redress the Khilafat wrong. On 10th March 1920, the Khilafat conference met at Calcutta and decided upon non-cooperation as the best weapon to further the object of their agitation. On 9th June 1920, the Khilafat conference met at Allahabad and unanimously reaffirmed their resolve to resort to non-cooperation and appointed an executive committee to enforce and lay down a detailed program. On 22nd June 1920, the Muslims sent a message to the Viceroy stating that they would start non-cooperation if the Turkish grievances were not redressed before 1st August 1920. On 30th June 1920, the Khilafat Committee, meeting held at Allahabad, resolved to start non-cooperation after a month's notice to the Viceroy. Notice was given on 1st July 1920 and non-cooperation commenced on 1st August 1920. This short resume shows that the non-cooperation was started by the Khilafat Committee, and all that the Congress special session at Calcutta did was to adopt what the Khilafat conference had already done, and that too not in the interest of Swaraj, but in the interest of helping the Muslims in furthering the cause of Khilafat. This is clear from the perusal of the Congress resolution passed at the special session held at Calcutta. Reference to, in view of the fact that on the Khilafat question, both the Indians and imperial governments have signally failed in their duty towards the Muslims of India, and the Prime Minister has deliberately broken his pledged word given to them, and that it is the duty of every non-Muslim Indian in every legitimate manner to assist his Muslim brother in his attempt to remove the religious calamity that has overtaken him. And in view of the fact that in the matter of the events of the April of 1919, both the said governments have grossly neglected or failed to protect the innocent people of the Punjab and punish officers guilty of unsoldierly and barbarous behavior towards them, and have exonerated Sir Michael O'Dyer, who proved himself directly responsible for most of the official crimes and callous to the sufferings of the people placed under his administration, and that the debate in the House of Lords betrayed a woeful lack of sympathy with the people of India, and systematic terrorism and frightfulness adopted in the Punjab, and that the latest viceregal pronouncement is proof of entire absence of repentance in the matters of the Khilafat and the Punjab. This Congress is of opinion that there can be no contentment in India without redress of the two aforementioned wrongs, and that the only effectual means to vindicate national honor and to prevent a repetition of similar wrongs in future is the establishment of Swaraj. This Congress is further of opinion that there is no course left open for the people of India but to approve of and adopt the policy of progressive, non-violent, non-cooperation inaugurated by Mahatma Gandhi until the said wrongs are righted and Swaraj is established. Mrs. Annie Besant says, "It will be remembered that Mr. Gandhi in March 1920 had forbidden the mixing up of non-cooperation in defense of the Khilafat with other questions, but it was found that the Khilafat was not sufficiently attractive to Hindus. So at the meeting of the All India Congress Committee held at Banaras on May 30 and 31, the Punjab atrocities and the deficiencies of the Reforms Act were added to the list of provocative causes. Reference to The Future of Indian Politics, page 250. Inverted comma closed, reference over. Although the non-cooperation movement was launched by the Khilafat Committee and merely adopted by the Congress primarily to help the Khilafat cause, the person who suggested it to the Khilafat Committee and who identified himself with the committee and took the responsibility of giving effect to it and who brought about its adoption by the Congress was Mr. Gandhi. At the first Khilafat conference held at Delhi on 23rd November 1919, Mr. Gandhi was present. Not only was Mr. Gandhi present, but also it was he who advised the Muslims to adopt non-cooperation as a method for forcing the British to yield to their demands regarding the Khilafat. The joining of Mr. Gandhi in the Khilafat movement is full of significance. The Muslims were anxious to secure the support of the Hindus in the cause of Khilafat. At the conference held on 23rd November 1919, the Muslims had invited the Hindus. Again, on 3rd June 1920, a joint meeting of the Hindus and the Khilafatist Muslims was held at Allahabad. This meeting was attended, among others, by Sapru, Motilal Nehru and Annie Besant. But the Hindus were hesitant in joining the Muslims. Mr. Gandhi was the only Hindu who joined the Muslims. Not only did he show courage to join them, but also he kept step with them, nay, led them. On 9th June 1920, when the Khilafat Conference met at Allahabad and formed an executive committee to prepare a detailed program of non-cooperation and give effect to it, Mr. Gandhi was the only Hindu on that executive committee. On 22nd June 1920, the Muslims sent a message to the Viceroy that they would start non-cooperation if the Turkish grievances were not redressed before 1st August 1920. On the same day, Mr. Gandhi also sent a letter to the Viceroy explaining the justice of the Khilafat cause, the reasons why he has taken up the cause, and the necessity of satisfying the hands of the Khilafatists. For instance, the notice given to the Viceroy on 1st July 1920 that non-cooperation will be started on 1st August was given by Mr. Gandhi and not by the Khilafatists. Again, when non-cooperation was started by the Khilafatists on 31st August 1920, Mr. Gandhi was the first to give a concrete shape to it by returning his medal. After inaugurating the non-cooperation movement as an active member of the Khilafat Committee, Mr. Gandhi next directed his energy to the cause of persuading the Congress to adopt non-cooperation and strengthen the Khilafat movement. With that object in view, Mr. Gandhi toured the country between 1st August and 1st September 1920 in the company of the Ali brothers, who were the founders of the Khilafat movement, impressing upon the people the necessity of non-cooperation. People could notice the disharmony in the tune of Mr. Gandhi and the Ali brothers. As the Modern Review pointed out, reading between the lines of their speeches, it is not difficult to see that with one of them, the sad plight of the Khilafat in distant Turkey is the central fact, while with the other, attainment of Swaraj here in India is the object in view. This dichotomy of interest did not augur well for the success of the ultimate purpose. Reference to Mr. Gandhi repudiated the suggestion of the Modern Review and regarded it as cruelest cut. Dealing with the criticism of the Modern Review, in his article in Young India for 20th October 1920, Mr. Gandhi said, "I claim that with us, both the Khilafat is the central fact, with Maulana Mahmud Ali because it is his religion, with me because in laying down my life for the Khilafat, I ensure safety of the cow, that is my religion, from the Musalman knife." Inverted comma closed. Nonetheless, Mr. Gandhi succeeded in carrying the Congress with him in support of the Khilafat cause. Reference to the resolution of non-cooperation was carried by 1,886 votes against 884 votes. The late Mr. Tarsi once told me that a large majority of the delegates were no other than the taxi drivers of Calcutta who were paid to vote for the non-cooperation resolution. Reference over. For a long time, the Hindus had been engaged in wooing the Muslims to their side. The Congress was very anxious to bridge the gulf between itself and the Muslim League. The ways and means adopted in 1916 for bringing about this consummation, and which resulted in the Lucknow Pact signed between the Congress and the Muslim League, have been graphically told by Swami Shraddhanand in his impressions of the Congress session held in that year at Lucknow. Says the Swami, reference to Liberator, 22nd April 1926. Inverted comma begins, on sitting on the dais, that is Lucknow Congress platform, the first thing that I noticed was that the number of Muslim delegates was proportionately fourfold of what it was at Lahore in 1893. The majority of Muslim delegates had donned gold, silver, and silk embroidered chogas, that is flowing robes, over their ordinary coarse suits of wearing apparel. It was rumored that these chogas had been put by Hindu moneyed men for Congress tamasha. Of some 433 Muslim delegates, only some 30 had come from outside, the rest belonging to Lucknow city, and of these majority was admitted free to delegate seats, board and lodging. Sir Said Ahmed's anti-Congress league had tried in a public meeting to dissuade Muslims from joining the Congress as delegates. As a counter move, the Congress people lighted the whole Congress camp some 4 nights before the session began and advertised that that night would be free. The result was that all the Chandul Khans of Lucknow were emptied and a huge audience of some 30,000 Hindus and Muslims was addressed from half a dozen platforms. It was then that the Muslim delegates were elected or selected. All this was admitted by the Lucknow Congress organizers to me in private. A show was being made of the Muslim delegates. Muslim delegates gets up to second a resolution in Urdu. He begins, Hazrat, I'm a Mohammedan delegate. Some Hindu delegate gets up and calls for 3 cheers for Mohammedan delegates, and the response is so enthusiastic as to be beyond description. Inverted comma closed, reference over. In taking up the cause of Khilafat, Mr. Gandhi achieved a double purpose. He carried the Congress plan of winning over the Muslims to its culmination. Secondly, he made the Congress a power in the country, which it would not have been if the Muslims had not joined it. The cause of the Khilafat appealed to the Muslimans far more than political safeguards, with the result that the Muslimans who were outside it trooped into the Congress. The Hindus welcomed them, for they saw in this a common front against the British, which was their main aim. The credit for this must of course go to Mr. Gandhi, for there can be no doubt that this was an act of great daring. When the Muslimans in 1919 approached the Hindus for participation in the non-cooperation movement which the Muslims desired to start for helping Turkey and the Khilafat, the Hindus were found to be divided in 3 camps. One was a camp of those who were opposed to non-cooperation in principle. A second camp consisted of those Hindus who were prepared to join the Muslims in their campaign of non-cooperation provided the Muslims agreed to give up cow slaughter. A third group consisted of the Hindus who feared that the Mohammedans might extend their non-cooperation to inviting the Afghans to invade India, in which case the movement, instead of resulting in Swaraj, might result in the subjection of India to Muslim Raj. Mr. Gandhi did not care for those Hindus who were opposed to joining the Muslims in the non-cooperation movement. But with regard to the others, he told them that their attitude was unfortunate. To those Hindus who wanted to give their support on the condition that the Muslims give up cow killing, Mr. Gandhi said, reference to Young India, 10th December 1919. Inverted comma begins, it is easy enough to understand and justify the Hindu caution. It is difficult to resist the Mohammedan position. In my opinion, the best way to prevent India from becoming the battleground between the forces of Islam and those of the English is for Hindus to make non-cooperation a complete and immediate success, and I have little doubt that if the Mohammedans remain true to their declared intention and are able to exercise self-restraint and make sacrifices, the Hindus will play the game and join them in the campaign of non-cooperation. I feel equally certain that Hindus will not assist Mohammedans in promoting or bringing about an armed conflict between the British government and their allies and Afghanistan. British forces are too well organized to admit of any successful invasion of the Indian frontier. The only way, therefore, the Mohammedans can carry on an effective struggle on behalf of the honor of Islam is to take up non-cooperation in real earnest. It will not only be completely effective if it is adopted by the people on an extensive scale, but it will also provide full scope for individual conscience. If I cannot bear an injustice done by an individual or a corporation, and I am directly or indirectly instrumental in upholding that individual or corporation, I must answer for it before my Maker. But I have done all that is humanly possible for me to do consistently with the moral code that refuses to injure even the wrongdoers. If I cease to support the injustice in the manner described above. In applying, therefore, such a great force, there should be no haste, there should be no temper shown. Non-cooperation must be and remain absolutely a voluntary effort. The whole thing then depends upon Mohammedans themselves. If they will but help themselves, Hindu help will come, and the government, great and mighty though it is, will have to bend before the bloodless opposition of a whole nation. Inverted comma, close. Unfortunately, the hope of Mr. Gandhi that no government can possibly withstand the bloodless opposition of a whole nation did not come true. Within a year of the starting of the non-cooperation movement, Mr. Gandhi had to admit that the Mussalmans had grown impatient and that, inverted comma begins, in their impatient anger, the Mussalmans asked for more energetic and more prompt action by the Congress and Khilafat organizations. To the Mussalmans, Swaraj means, as it must mean, India's ability to deal effectively with the Khilafat question. The Mussalmans, therefore, declined to wait if the attainment of Swaraj means indefinite delay of a program that may require the Mussalmans of India to become impotent witnesses of the extinction of Turkey in European waters. It is impossible not to sympathize with this attitude. I would gladly recommend immediate action if I could think of any effective course. I would gladly ask for postponement of Swaraj activity if thereby we could advance the interest of Khilafat. I could gladly take up measures outside non-cooperation if I could think of any in order to assuage the pain caused to the millions of the Mussalmans. But in my humble opinion, attainment of Swaraj is the quickest method of righting the Khilafat wrong. Hence it is that for me the solution of the Khilafat question is attainment of Swaraj and vice versa. The only way to help the affiliated Turks is for India to generate sufficient power to be able to assert herself. If she cannot develop that power in time, there is no way out for India and she must resign herself to the inevitable. What can a paralytic do to stretch forth a helping hand to a neighbor but to try to cure himself of his paralysis? Mere ignorant, thoughtless and angry outburst of violence may give vent to pent-up rage but can bring no relief to Turkey. Inverted comma closed. The Mussalmans were not in a mood to listen to the advice of Mr. Gandhi. They refused to worship the principle of non-violence. They were not prepared to wait for Swaraj. They were in a hurry to find the most expeditious means of helping Turkey and saving the Khilafat. And the Muslims, in their impatience, did exactly what the Hindus feared they would do, namely, invite the Afghans to invade India. How far the Khilafatists had proceeded in their negotiations with the Amir of Afghanistan, it is not possible to know. But that such a project was entertained by them is beyond question. It needs no saying that the project of an invasion of India was the most dangerous project, and every sane Indian would dissociate himself from so mad a project. What part Mr. Gandhi played in this project, it is not possible to discover. Certainly, he did not dissociate himself from it. On the contrary, his misguided zeal for Swaraj and his obsession on Hindu-Muslim unity as the only means of achieving it led him to support the project. Not only did he advise the Amir not to enter into any treaty with the British government, but declared, inverted comma begins, I would, in a sense, certainly assist the Amir of Afghanistan if he waged war against the British government. That is to say, I would openly tell my countrymen that it would be a crime to help a government which had lost the confidence of the nation to remain in power, inverted comma closed, reference to Young India, dated 4th May 1921. Can any sane man go so far for the sake of Hindu-Muslim unity? But Mr. Gandhi was so attached to Hindu-Muslim unity that he did not stop to enquire what he was really doing in this mad endeavor. So anxious was Mr. Gandhi in laying the foundation of Hindu-Muslim unity well and truly that he did not forget to advise his followers regarding the national crisis. In an article in Young India of 8th September 1920, Mr. Gandhi said, inverted comma begins, during the Madras tour at Baiswara, I had occasion to remark upon the national crisis and suggested that it would be better to have cries about ideals than men. I asked the audience to replace Mahatma Gandhi ki Jai and Mahmood Ali Shaukat Ali ki Jai by Hindu Musalman ki Jai. Brother Shaukat Ali, who followed positively, laid down the law. In spite of the Hindu-Muslim unity, he had observed that if Hindus shouted Bande Matram, the Muslims rang out with Allahu Akbar and vice versa. This, he rightly said, jarred on the ear and still showed that the people did not act with one mind. There should be therefore only 3 cries recognized: Allahu Akbar, to be joyously sung out by Hindus and Muslims, showing that God alone was great and no other. The second should be Bande Matram, that is, Hail Motherland, or Bharat Mata Ki Jai, that is, victory to Mother Hind. The third should be Hindu Musalman Ki Jai, without which there was no victory for India and no true demonstration of the greatness of God. I do wish that the newspapers and public men would take up the Maulana's suggestion and lead the people only to use the 3 cries. They are full of meaning. The first is a prayer and confession of our littleness and therefore a sign of humility. It is a cry in which all Hindus and Muslims should join in reverence and prayerfulness. Hindus may not fight shy of Arabic words when their meaning is not only totally inoffensive but even ennobling. God is no respecter of any particular tongue. Bande Matram, apart from its wonderful associations, expresses the one national wish, the rise of India to her full height. And I should prefer Bande Matram to Bharat Mata Ki Jai, as it would be a graceful recognition of the intellectual and emotional superiority of Bengal. Since India can be nothing without the union of the Hindu and the Muslim heart, Hindu Musalman Ki Jai is a cry which we may never forget. There should be no discordance in these cries. Immediately someone has taken up any of the three cries, the rest should take it up and not attempt to yell out their favorite. Those who do not wish to join may refrain, but should consider it a breach of etiquette to interpolate their own when a cry has already been raised. It would be better, too, always to follow out the three cries in the order given above. Inverted comma closed. These are not the only things Mr. Gandhi has done to build up Hindu-Muslim unity. He has never called the Muslims to account even when they have been guilty of gross crimes against Hindus. It is a notorious fact that many prominent Hindus who had offended the religious susceptibilities of the Muslims either by their writings or by their part in the Shuddhi movement have been murdered by some fanatic Musalmans. First to suffer was Swami Shraddhanand, who was shot by Abdul Rashid on 23rd December 1926 when he was lying in his sick bed. This was followed by the murder of Lala Nanak Chand, a prominent Arya Samajist of Delhi. Rajpal, the author of the Rangila Rasool, was stabbed by Ilamuddin on 6th April 1929 while he was sitting in his shop. Nathu Ramlal Sharma was murdered by Abdul Qayyum in September 1934. It was an act of great daring, for Sharma was stabbed to death in the court of the Judicial Commissioner of Sindh, where he was seated awaiting the hearing of his appeal against his conviction under Section 195 IPC for the publication of a pamphlet on the history of Islam. Khanna, the secretary of the Hindu Sabha, was severely assaulted in 1938 by the Mohammedans after the session of the Hindu Mahasabha held in Ahmedabad and very narrowly escaped death. This is of course a very short list and could be easily expanded. But whether the number of prominent Hindus killed by fanatic Muslims is large or small matters little. What matters is the attitude of those who count towards these murderers. The murderers paid the penalty of law where law is enforced. The leading Muslims, however, never condemned these criminals. On the contrary, they were hailed as religious martyrs and agitation was carried on for clemency being shown to them. As an illustration of this attitude, one may refer to Mr. Barkat Ali, a barrister of Lahore, who argued the appeal of Abdul Qayyum. He went to the length of saying that Qayyum was not guilty of murder of Nathu Ramlal because his act was justifiable by the law of the Quran. This attitude of the Muslims is quite understandable. What is not understandable is the attitude of Mr. Gandhi. Mr. Gandhi has been very punctilious in the matter of condemning any and every act of violence and has forced the Congress, much against its will, to condemn it. But Mr. Gandhi has never protested against such murders. Not only have the Musalmans not condemned these outrages, but even Mr. Gandhi has never called upon the leading Muslims to condemn them. Reference to, it is reported that for earning merit for the soul of Abdul Rashid, the murderer of Swami Shraddhanand, in the next world, the students and professors or the famous theological college at Deoband finished 5 complete recitations of the Quran and had planned to finish daily 1,25,000 recitations of Quranic verses. Their prayer was, God Almighty may give the marhum, that is Rashid, a place in the Alai Ilayin, that is the summit of the 7th heaven. Times of India, 30/11/1927 through Indian Eyes columns. Reference over. He has kept silent over them. Such an attitude can be explained only on the ground that Mr. Gandhi was anxious to preserve Hindu-Muslim unity and did not mind the murders of a few Hindus if it could be achieved by sacrificing their lives. This attitude to excuse the Muslims any wrong, lest it should injure the cause of unity, is well illustrated by what Mr. Gandhi had to say in the matter of the Mopla riots. The blood-curdling atrocities committed by the Moplas in Malabar against the Hindus were indescribable. All over southern India, a wave of horrified feeling had spread among the Hindus of every shade of opinion. which was intensified when certain Khilafat leaders were so misguided as to pass resolution of congratulations to the Moplas on the brave fight they were conducting for the sake of religion. Any person could have said that this was too heavy a price for Hindu-Muslim unity. But Mr. Gandhi was so much obsessed by the necessity of establishing Hindu-Muslim unity that he was prepared to make light of the doings of the Moplas and the Khilafats who were congratulating them. He spoke of the Moplas as the brave, God-fearing Moplas who were fighting for what they consider as religion and in a manner which they consider as religious. Speaking of the Muslim silence over the Mopla atrocities, Mr. Gandhi told the Hindus, inverted comma begins, the Hindus must have the courage and the faith to feel that they can protect their religion in spite of such fanatical corruptions. A verbal disapproval by the Mussalmans of Mopla madness is no test of Mussalman friendship. The Mussalmans must naturally feel the shame and humiliation of the Mopla conduct about forcible conversions and looting, and they must work away so silently and effectively that such a thing might become impossible even on the part of the most fanatical among them. My belief is that the Hindus as a body have received the Mopla madness with equanimity, and that the cultured Mussalmans are sincerely sorry of the Mopla's perversion of the teaching of the Prophet. Inverted comma closed. The resolution passed by the Working Committee of the Congress on the Mopla atrocities shows how careful the Congress was not to hurt the feelings of the Mussalmans. Inverted comma begins. The Working Committee places on record its sense of deep regret over the deeds of violence done by Moplas in certain areas of Malabar. These deeds being evidence of the fact that there are still people in India who have not understood the message of the Congress and the Central Khilafat Committee, and calls upon every Congress and Khilafat worker to spread the said message of non-violence even under the gravest provocation throughout the length and breadth of India. Whilst, however, condemning violence on the part of the Moplas, the Working Committee desires it to be known that the evidence in its possession shows that provocation beyond endurance was given to the Moplas, and that the reports published by and on behalf of the government have given a one-sided and highly exaggerated account of the wrongs done by the Moplas and an understatement of the needless destruction of life resorted to by the government in the name of peace and order. The Working Committee regrets to find that there have been instances of so-called forcible conversions by some fanatics among Moplas, but warns the public against believing in the government and inspired versions. Reference to the resolution says that there were only 3 cases of forcible conversion. In reply to a question in the Central Legislature debates 16th January 1922, Sir William Vincent replied, "The Madras government report that the number of forcible conversions probably runs to thousands, but that for obvious reasons it will never be possible to obtain anything like an accurate estimate." Reference over. The report before the committee says, inverted comma begins, the families which have been reported to have been forcibly converted into Mohammedanism lived in the neighborhood of Manjeri. It is clear that conversions were forced upon Hindus by a fanatic gang, which was always opposed to the Khilafat and non-cooperation movement, and there were only 3 cases so far, as our information goes, inverted comma closed. The following instances of Muslim intransigence over which Mr. Gandhi kept mum are recorded by Swami Shraddhanand in his weekly journal called The Liberator. Writing in the issue of 30th September 1926, the Swamiji says, inverted comma begins, as regards the removal of untouchability, it has been authoritatively ruled several times that it is the duty of Hindus to expiate for their past sins, and non-Hindus should have nothing to do with it. But the Mohammedan and the Christian congressmen have openly revolted against the dictum of Mr. Gandhi at Wycombe and other places. Even such an unbiased leader as Mr. Yaqub Hassan, presiding over a meeting called to present an address to me at Madras, openly enjoined upon Mussalmans the duty of converting all the untouchables in India to Islam, inverted comma closed. But Mr. Gandhi said nothing by way of remonstrance either to the Muslims or to the Christians. In his issue of July 1926, the Swamiji writes, inverted comma begins, there was another prominent fact to which I drew the attention of Mahatma Gandhi. Both of us went together one night to the Khilafat conference at Nagpur. The ayats, that is the verses of the Quran, recited by the Maulanas on that occasion, contained frequent references to jihad and killing of the kafirs. But when I drew his attention to this phase of the Khilafat movement, Mahatma Ji smiled and said, they are alluding to the British bureaucracy. In reply, I said that it was all subversive of the idea of non-violence, and when the reversion of feeling came, the Mohammedan Maulanas would not refrain from using these verses against the Hindus, inverted comma closed. The Swami's third instance relates to the Mopla riots. Writing in the Liberator of 26th August 1926, the Swami says, inverted comma begins, the first warning was sounded when the question of condemning the Moplas for their atrocities on Hindus came up in the subjects committee. The original resolution condemned the Moplas wholesale for the killing of Hindus and burning of Hindu homes and the forcible conversion to Islam. The Hindu members themselves proposed amendments till it was reduced to condemning only certain individuals who had been guilty of the above crimes. But some of the Muslim leaders could not bear this even. Maulana Fakir and other Maulanas, of course, opposed the resolution, and there was no wonder. But I was surprised an out-and-out nationalist like Maulana Hasrat Mohani opposed the resolution on the ground that the Mopla country no longer remained Darul Aman but became Darul Harab, and they suspected the Hindus of collusion with the British enemies of the Moplas. Therefore, the Moplas were right in presenting the Quran or sword to the Hindus. And if the Hindus became Mussalmans to save themselves from death, it was a voluntary change of faith and not forcible conversion. Well, even the harmless resolution condemning some of the Moplas was not unanimously passed but had to be accepted by a majority of votes only. There were other indications also showing that the Mussalmans considered the Congress to be existing on their sufferance, and if there was the least attempt to ignore their idiosyncrasies, the superficial unity would be scrapped as under. Inverted comma closed. The last one refers to the burning of the foreign cloth started by Mr. Gandhi. Writing in the Liberator of 31st August 1926, the Swamiji says, inverted comma begins, while people came to the conclusion that the burning of foreign cloth was a religious duty of Indians and Messrs. Das, Nehru and other topmost leaders made bonfire of cloth worth thousands. The Khilafat Mussalmans got permission from Mahatma Ji to send all foreign cloth for the use of the Turkish brethren. This again was a great shock to me. While Mahatma Ji stood adamant and did not have the least regard for Hindu feelings when a question of principle was involved, for the Muslim dereliction of duty, there was always a soft corner in his heart. Inverted comma closed. In the history of his efforts to bring about Hindu-Muslim unity, mention must be made of two incidents. One is the fast which Mr. Gandhi underwent in the year 1924. It was a fast of 21 days. Before undertaking the fast, Mr. Gandhi explained the reasons for it in a statement from which these extracts are taken. Inverted comma begins, the fact that Hindus and Mussalmans, who were only 2 years ago apparently working together as friends, are now fighting like cats and dogs in some places, shows conclusively that the non-cooperation they offered was not non-violent. I saw the symptoms in Bombay, Chauri Chaura, in a host of minor cases. I did penance then. It had its effects pronto, but this Hindu-Muslim tension was unthinkable. It became unbearable on hearing of the Kohat tragedy. On the eve of my departure from Sabarmati for Delhi, Sarojini Devi wrote to me that speeches and homilies on peace would not do. I must find out an effective remedy. She was right in saddling the responsibility on me. Had I not been instrumental in bringing into being the vast energy of the people, I must find the remedy if the energy proved self-destructive. I was violently shaken by Amethi, Sambhal and Gulbarga. I had read the reports about Amethi and Sambhal prepared by Hindu and Mussalman friends. I had learnt the joint finding of Hindu and Mussalman friends who went to Gulbarga. I was writhing in deep pain, and yet I had no remedy. The news of Kohat set the smouldering mass aflame. Something had got to be done. I passed 2 nights in restlessness and pain. On Wednesday, I knew the remedy. I must do penance. It is a warning to the Hindus and Mussalmans who have professed to love me. If they have loved me truly, and if I have been deserving of their love, they will do penance with me for the grave sin of denying God in their hearts. The penance of Hindus and Mussalmans is not fasting, but retracting their steps. It is true penance for a Mussalman to harbor no ill will for his Hindu brother, and an equally true penance for a Hindu to harbor none for his Mussalman brother. I did not consult friends, not even Hakim Sahib, who was close with me for a long time on Wednesday, not Maulana Mahmud Ali, under whose roof I am enjoying the privilege of hospitality. But was it right for me to go through the fast under a Mussalman roof? Gandhi was at the time the guest of Mr. Mahmud Ali at Delhi. Yes, it was. The fast is not born out of ill will against a single soul. My being under a Mussalman roof ensures it against any such interpretation. It is in the fitness of things that this fast should be taken up and completed in a Mussalman house. And who is Mahmud Ali? Only 2 days before the fast, we had a discussion about a private matter in which I had told him what was mine was his and what was his was mine. Let me gratefully tell the public that I have never received warmer or better treatment than under Mahmud Ali's roof. Every want of mine is anticipated. The dominant thought of every one of his household is to make me and mine happy and comfortable. Doctors Ansari and Abdur Rahman have constituted themselves my medical advisors. They examine me daily. I have had many a happy occasion in my life. This is no less happy than the previous ones. Bread is not everything. I am experiencing here the richest love. It is more than bread for me. It has been whispered that by going so much with Mussalman friends, I make myself unfit to know the Hindu mind. The Hindu mind is myself. Surely I do not live amidst Hindus to know the Hindu mind when every fiber of my being is Hindu. My Hinduism must be a very poor thing if it cannot flourish under influences the most adverse. I know instinctively what is necessary for Hinduism, but I must labor to discover the Mussalman mind. The closer I come to the best of Mussalmans, the juster I am likely to be in my estimate of the Mussalmans and their doings. I am striving to become the best cement between the two communities. My longing is to be able to cement the two with my blood if necessary. But before I can do so, I must prove to the Mussalmans that I love them as well as I love the Hindus. My religion teaches me to love all equally. May God help me to do so. My fast, among other things, is meant to qualify me for achieving that equal and selfless love. Inverted comma closed. The fast produced unity conferences, but the unity conferences produced nothing except pious resolutions which were broken as soon as they were announced. This short historical sketch of the part Mr. Gandhi played in bringing about Hindu-Muslim unity may be concluded by a reference to the attitude of Mr. Gandhi in the negotiations about the communal settlement. He offered the Muslims a blank check. The blank check only served to exasperate the Muslims as they interpreted it as an act of evasion. He opposed the separate electorates at the Round Table Conference. When they were given to the Muslims by the communal award, Mr. Gandhi and the Congress did not approve of them. But when it came to voting upon it, they took the strange attitude of neither approving it nor opposing it. Such is the history of Mr. Gandhi's efforts to bring about Hindu-Muslim unity. What fruits did these efforts bear? To be able to answer this question, it is necessary to examine the relationship between the two communities during 1920 to 1940, the years during which Mr. Gandhi labored so hard to bring about Hindu-Muslim unity. The relationship is well described in the annual reports on the affairs of India submitted year by year to Parliament by the Government of India under the old Government of India Act. It is one of these reports that I have drawn for the facts recorded. Reference to the series is known as India in 1920 and so on. Reference over. Beginning with the year 1920, there occurred in that year in Malabar what is known as the Mopla Rebellion. It was the result of the agitation carried out by two Muslim organizations, the Khuddami Kaaba, that is Servants of the Mecca Shrine, and the Central Khilafat Committee. Agitators actually preached the doctrine that India under the British government was Darul Harab and that the Muslims must fight against it, and if they could not, they must carry out the alternative principle of Hijrat. The Moplas were suddenly carried off their feet by this agitation. The outbreak was essentially a rebellion against the British government. The aim was to establish the kingdom of Islam by overthrowing the British government. Knives, swords and spears were secretly manufactured. Bands of desperadoes collected for an attack on British authority. On 20th August, a severe encounter took place between the Moplas and the British forces at Pirunnagadi. Roads were blocked, telegraph lines cut, and the railway destroyed in a number of places. As soon as the administration had been paralyzed, the Moplas declared that Swaraj had been established. A certain Ali Mudliyar was proclaimed Raja, Khilafat flags were flown, and Ernar and Vallurana were declared Khilafat kingdoms. As a rebellion against the British government, it was quite understandable. But what baffled most was the treatment accorded by the Moplas to the Hindus of Malabar. The Hindus were visited by a dire fate at the hands of the Moplas. Massacres, forcible conversions, desecration of temples, foul outrages upon women, such as ripping open pregnant women, pillage, arson and destruction. In short, all the accompaniments of brutal and unrestrained barbarism were perpetrated freely by the Moplas upon the Hindus until such time as troops could be hurried to the task of restoring order through a difficult and extensive tract of the country. This was not a Hindu-Muslim riot. This was just a Bartholomew. The number of Hindus who were killed, wounded or converted is not known, but the number must have been enormous. In the year 1921-22, communal jealousies did not subside. The Muharram celebrations had been attended by serious riots both in Bengal and in the Punjab. In the latter province in particular, communal feeling at Multan reached very serious heights, and although the casualty list was comparatively small, a great deal of damage to property was done. Though the year 1922-23 was a peaceful year, the relation between the two communities was strained throughout 1923 to 1924. But in no locality did this tension produce such tragic consequences as in the city of Kohat. The immediate cause of the trouble was the publication and circulation of a pamphlet containing a virulently anti-Islamic poem. Terrible riots broke out on the 9th and 10th of September 1924. The total casualties being about 155 killed and wounded. House property to the estimated value of rupees 9 lakh was destroyed and a large quantity of goods were looted. As a result of this reign of terror, the whole Hindu population evacuated the city of Kohat. After protracted negotiations, an agreement of reconciliation was concluded between the two communities, government giving an assurance that subject to certain reservations, the prosecution pending against persons concerned in rioting should be dropped. With the object of enabling the sufferers to restart their businesses and rebuild their houses, government sanctioned advances free of interest in certain instances, amounting to rupees 5 lakhs. But even after the settlement had been reached and evacuees had returned to Kohat, there was no peace, and throughout 1924 to 25, the tension between the Hindu and Mussalman masses in various parts of the country increased to a lamentable extent. In the summer months, there was a distressing number of riots. In July, severe fighting broke out between Hindus and Mussalmans in Delhi, which was accompanied by serious casualties. In the same month, there was a bad outbreak at Nagpur. August was even worse. There were riots at Lahore, at Lucknow, at Moradabad, at Bhagalpur and Nagpur in British India, while a severe affray took place at Gulbarga in the Nizam's dominions. September-October saw severe fighting at Lucknow, Shahjahanpur, Kakinada and at Allahabad. The most terrible outbreak of the year being the one that took place at Kohat, which was accompanied by murder, arson and loot. In 1925-26, the antagonism between the Hindus and the Muslims became widespread. Very significant features of the Hindu-Muslim rioting which took place during this year were its wide distribution and its occurrence, in some cases in small villages. Calcutta, the United Provinces, the Central Provinces and the Bombay Presidency were all scenes of riots, some of which led to regrettable losses of life. Certain minor and local Hindu festivals which occurred at the end of August gave rise to communal trouble in Calcutta, in Berar, in Gujarat and in the Bombay Presidency and in the United Provinces. In some of these places, there were actual clashes between the two communities, but elsewhere, notably at Kakinada, one of the most thickly populated jute mill centers of Calcutta, serious rioting was prevented by the activity of the police. In Gujarat, Hindu-Muslim feeling was running high in these days and was marked by at least one case of temple desecration. The important Hindu festival of Ram Leela at the end of September gave rise to acute anxiety in many places, and at Aligarh, an important place in the United Provinces, its celebration was marked by one of the worst riots of the year. The riot assumed such dangerous proportions that the police were compelled to fire in order to restore order, and 5 persons were killed either by the police or by riots. At Lucknow, the same festival gave rise at one time to a threatening situation, but the local authorities prevented actual rioting. October saw another serious riot at Sholapur in the Bombay Presidency. There, the local Hindus were taking a car with Hindu idols through the city, and when they came near a mosque, a dispute arose between them and certain Muslims, which developed into a riot. A deplorable rioting started in Calcutta in the beginning of April as an affray outside a mosque between Muslims and some Arya Samajists, and continued to spread until 5th April. Though there was only one occasion on which the police or military were faced by a crowd which showed determined resistance, namely on the evening of the 5th April, when fire had to be opened. There was also a great deal of incendiarism, and in the first 3 days of this incendiarism, the fire brigade had to deal with 110 fires. An unprecedented feature of the riots was the attacks on temples by Muslims and on the mosques by Hindus, which naturally led to intense bitterness. There were 44 deaths and 584 injured. There was a certain amount of looting and business was suspended with great economic loss to Calcutta. Shops began to reopen soon after the 5th, but the period of tension was prolonged by the approach of a Hindu festival on the 13th of April and of the Eid on the 14th. The Sikhs were to have taken out a procession on the 13th, but government were unable to give them the necessary license. The apprehensions with regard to the 13th and 14th of April fortunately did not materialize, and outward peace prevailed until 22nd April, when it was abruptly broken as a result of a petty quarrel in a street, which restarted the rioting. Fighting between the mobs of the two communities, generally on a small scale, accompanied by isolated assaults and murders, continued for 6 days. During this period, there were no attacks on the temples and mosques, and there was little arson or looting. But there were more numerous occasions on which the hostile mobs did not immediately disperse on the appearance of the police, and on 12 occasions it was necessary to open fire. The total number of casualties during this second phase of the rioting was 66 deaths and 391 injured. The dislocation of business was much more serious during the first riots, and the closing of Marwari business houses was not without an effect on European business firms. Panic caused many of the markets to be wholly or partially closed, and for 2 days the meat supply was practically stopped. So great was the panic that the removal of refuse in the disturbed area was stopped. Arrangements were, however, made to protect supplies, and the difficulty with the municipal scavengers was overcome as soon as the municipality had applied to the police for protection. There was slight extension of the area of rioting, but no disturbances occurred in the mill area around Calcutta. Systematic raiding of the portions of the disturbed area, the arrest of hooligans, the seizure of weapons, and the reinforcement of the police by the posting of British soldiers to act as special police officers had the desired effect. And the last 3 days of April, in spite of the continuance of isolated assaults and murders, witnessed a steady improvement in the situation. Isolated murders were largely attributable to hooligans of both communities, and their persistence during the first as well as the second outbreak induced a general belief that these hooligans were hired assassins. Another equally persistent feature of the riots, namely the distribution of inflammatory printed leaflets by both sides, together with the employment of hired rogues, strengthened the belief that money had been spent to keep the riots going. The year 1926-27 was one continuous period of communal riots. Since April 1926, every month witnessed a phrase more or less serious between partisans of the two communities, and only 2 months passed without actual rioting in the legal sense of the word. The examination of the circumstances of these numerous riots and affrays shows that they originated either in utterly petty and trivial disputes between individuals, as for example between a Hindu shopkeeper and a Mohammedan customer, or else the immediate cause of trouble was the celebration of some religious festival or the playing of music by Hindu processionists in the neighborhood of Mohammedan places of worship. 1 or 2 of the riots, indeed, were due to nothing more than strained nerves and general excitement. Of these, the most striking example occurred in Delhi on 24th June, when the bolting of a pony in a crowded street gave the impression that a riot had started, upon which both sides immediately attacked each other with brickbats and staves. Including the 2 outbursts of rioting in Calcutta during April and May 1926, 40 riots took place during the 12 months ending with April 1st, 1927, resulting in the death of 197 and injuries more or less severe to 1,598 persons. These disorders were widespread, but Bengal, the Punjab, and the United Provinces were the parts of India most seriously affected. Bengal suffered most from rioting, but on many occasions during the year, tension between Hindus and Mohammedans was high in the Bombay Presidency and also in Sindh. Calcutta remained uneasy throughout the whole of the summer. On 1st June, a petty dispute developed into a riot in which 40 persons were hurt. After this, there was a lull in overt violence until July 15th, on which day fell an important Hindu religious festival. During its celebration, the passage of a procession with bands playing in the neighborhood of certain mosques resulted in a conflict in which 14 persons were killed and 116 injured. The next day saw the beginning of the important Mohammedan festival of Muharram. Rioting broke out on that day, and after a lull was renewed on the 19th, 20th, 21st and 22nd. Isolated assaults and cases of stabbing occurred on the 23rd, 24th and 25th. The total ascertained casualties during this period of rioting were 28 deaths and 226 injured. There were further riots in Calcutta on the 15th September and 16th October, and on the latter day there was also rioting in the adjoining city of Howrah, during which 1 or 2 persons were killed and over 30 injured. The April and May riots had been greatly aggravated by incendiarism, but happily this feature was almost entirely absent from the later disorders, and during the July riots, for example, the fire brigade was called upon to deal with only 4 incendiary fires. Coming to the year 1927-28, the following facts stare us in the face. Between the beginning of April and the end of September 1927, no fewer than 25 riots were reported. Of these, 10 occurred in the United Provinces, 6 in the Bombay Presidency, 2 each in the Punjab, the Central Provinces, Bengal and Bihar and Orissa, and 1 in Delhi. The majority of these riots occurred during the celebration of a religious festival by one or other of the 2 communities, while some arose out of the playing of music by Hindus in the neighborhood of mosques or out of the slaughter of cows by the Muslims. The total casualties resulting from the above disorders were approximately 103 persons killed and 1,084 wounded. By far, the most serious riot reported during the year was that which took place in Lahore between the 4th and 7th of May 1927. Tension between the 2 communities had been acute for some time before the outbreak, and the trouble, when it came, was precipitated by a chance collision between a Mohammedan and 2 Sikhs. The disorder spread with lightning speed, and the heavy casualty list, 27 killed, 272 injured, was largely swollen by unorganized attacks on individuals. Police and troops were rushed to the scene of rioting quickly, and it was impossible for clashes on a big scale to take place between hostile groups. Casual assassinations and assaults were, however, reported for 2 or 3 days longer before the streets and lanes of Lahore became safe for the solitary passer-by. After the Lahore riot in May, there was a lull for 2 months in intercommunal rioting, if we accept a minor incident which happened about the middle of June in Bihar and Orissa. But July witnessed no fewer than 8 riots, of which the most serious occurred in Multan in the Punjab on the occasion of the annual Muharram celebrations. 13 killed and 24 wounded was the toll taken by this riot. But August was to see worse rioting still. In that month, 9 riots occurred, 2 of them resulting in heavy loss of life. In a riot in Bettiah, a town in Bihar and Orissa, arising out of a dispute over a religious procession, 11 persons were killed and over 100 injured, whilst the passage of a procession in front of a mosque in Bareilly in the United Provinces was the occasion of rioting, in which 14 persons were killed and 165 were injured. Fortunately, this proved to be the turning point in intercommunal trouble during the year, and September witnessed only 4 riots. One of these, however, the riot in Nagpur in the central provinces on September 4th, was second only to Lahore riot in seriousness and in the damage which it caused. The spark which started the fire was the trouble in connection with a Muslim procession, but the materials for the combustion had been collected for some time. 19 persons were killed and 123 injured were admitted to hospitals as a result of this riot, during the course of which many members of the Muslim community abandoned their homes in Nagpur. A feature of Hindu-Muslim relations during the year, which was hardly less serious than the riots, was the number of murderous outrages committed by members of one community against persons belonging to the other. Some of the most serious of these outrages perpetrated in connection with the agitation relating to Rangila Rasool and Risala Vartaman, 2 publications containing most scurrilous attack on the Prophet Muhammad, and as a result of them, a number of innocent persons lost their lives, sometimes in circumstances of great barbarity. In Lahore, a series of outrages against individuals led to a state of great excitement and insecurity during the summer of 1927. The excitement over the Rangila Rasool case had by now travelled far from its original centre, and by July had begun to produce unpleasant repercussions on and across the northwest frontier. Reference to Rangila Rasool was written in reply to Sita Chinala, a pamphlet written by a Muslim alleging that Sita, wife of Rama, the hero of Ramayana, was a prostitute. Reference over. The first signs of trouble in this region became apparent early in June, and by the latter part of July, the excitement had reached its height. On the British side of the border, firm and tactful handling of the situation by the local authorities averted what would have been a serious breach of the peace. Economic boycott of Hindus was freely advocated in the British frontier districts, especially in Peshawar, but this movement met with little success, and although the Hindus were maltreated in 1 or 2 villages, the arrest of the culprits, together with appropriate action under the criminal law, quickly restored order. Across the border, however, the indignation aroused by these attacks on the Prophet gave rise to more serious consequences. The frontier tribesmen are acutely sensitive to the appeal of religion, and when a well-known mullah started to preach against the Hindus among the Afridis and Shinwaris in the neighborhood of the Khyber Pass, his words fell on fruitful ground. He called upon the Afridis and Shinwaris to expel all the Hindus living in their midst unless they declared in writing that they dissociated themselves from the doings of their co-religionists down country. The first to expel their Hindu neighbors were 2 clans of the Khyber Afridis, namely the Kuikhel and Zakhel, on the 22nd July. From these, the excitement spread among their Shinwari neighbors, who gave their Hindu neighbors notice to quit a few days later. However, after the departure of some of the Hindus, the Shinwaris agreed to allow the remainder to stay on. Some of the Hindus on leaving the Khyber were roughly handled. In 2 cases, stones were thrown, though happily without any damage resulting. In a 3rd case, a Hindu was wounded and a large amount of property carried off, but this was recovered by Afridi Khasadars in full, and the culprits were fined for the offence. Thereafter, arrangements were made for the picketing of the road for the passage of any Hindu evacuating tribal territory. Under pressure from the political agent, an Afridi Jirga decided towards the end of July to suspend the Hindu boycott pending a decision in the Risala Vartaman case. In the following week, however, several Hindu families who had been living at Landi Kotal at the head of the Khyber Pass moved to Peshawar, refusing to accept assurances of the tribal chiefs, but leaving one person from each family behind to watch over their interests. All told, between 450 Hindus, men, women and children, had come into Peshawar by the middle of August, when the trouble was definitely on the wane. Some of the Hindus were definitely expelled, some were induced to leave their homes by threats, some left from fear, some no doubt from sympathy with their neighbors. This expulsion and voluntary exodus from tribal territory were without parallel. Hindus had lived there for more generations than most of them could record as valued and respected, and indeed as essential members of the tribal system, for whose protection the tribesmen had been jealous and whose blood feuds they commonly made their own. In all, about 450 Hindus left the Khyber during the excitement. Of these, about 330 had returned to their homes in tribal territory by the close of the year 1927. Most of the remainder had decided to settle, at any rate for the present, amid the more secure conditions of British India. The year 1928-29 was comparatively more peaceful than the year 1927-28. His Excellency Lord Irwin, by his speeches to the central legislature and outside, had given a strong impetus to the attempts to find some basis for agreement between the two communities on those questions of political importance which were responsible for the strained relations between them. Fortunately, the issues arising out of the inquiry by the Simon Commission, which was appointed in 1929, absorbed a large part of the energy and attention of the different communities, with the result that less importance came to be attached to local causes of conflict and more importance to the broad question of constitutional policy. Moreover, the legislation passed during the autumn session of the Indian legislature in 1927, penalizing the instigation of intercommunal hostility by the press, had some effect in improving the intercommunal disturbances. The number of riots during the 12 months ending with March 31st, 1929 was 22. Though the number of riots was comparatively small, the casualties swelled heavily by the Bombay riots were very serious, no fewer than 204 persons having been killed and nearly 1,000 injured. Of these, the fortnight's rioting in Bombay accounts for 149 killed and 739 injured. 7 of these 22 riots, or roughly 1/3 of them, occurred on the day of the celebration of the annual Muslim festival of Bakrid at the end of May. The celebration of this festival is always a dangerous time in Hindu-Muslim relations. The Muslim regard it as a day of animal sacrifice, and as the animal chosen is almost always a cow, the slightest tension between the two communities is apt to produce an explosion. Of the Bakrid riots, only 2 were serious, and both of them took place in the Punjab. The first took place in a village in the Ambala district, in which 10 people were killed and 9 injured. The other riot, which took place in Softa village in the Gurgaon district in the southern Punjab, attained considerable notoriety because of its sensational features. The village of Softa is about 27 miles south of Delhi and is inhabited by Muslims. This village is surrounded by villages occupied by Hindu cultivators who, on hearing that the Muslims of Softa intended to sacrifice a cow on the Eid day, objected to the sacrifice of the particular cow selected on the ground that it had been accustomed to graze in fields belonging to the Hindu cultivators. The dispute over the matter assumed a threatening aspect, and the superintendent of police of the district accordingly went with a small force of police, about 25 men in all, to try to keep peace. He took charge of the disputed cow and locked it up. But his presence did not deter the Hindu cultivators of a few neighboring villages from collecting about 1,000 people armed with pitchforks, spears and staves and going to Softa. The superintendent of police and an Indian revenue official who were present in the village assured the crowd that the cow, in connection with which the dispute had arisen, would not be sacrificed. But this did not satisfy the mob, which threatened to burn the whole village if any cow was sacrificed, and also demanded that the cow should be handed over to them. The superintendent of police refused to agree to this demand, whereupon the crowd became violent and began to throw stones at the police and to try to get round the latter into the village. The superintendent of police warned the crowd to disperse, but to no effect. He therefore fired one shot from his revolver as a further warning. Notwithstanding, the crowd still continued to advance, and the superintendent had to order his party of police to fire. Only one volley was fired at first, but as this did not cause the retreat of the mob, 2 more volleys had to be fired before the crowd slowly dispersed, driving off some cattle belonging to the village. While the police was engaged in this affair, a few Hindu cultivators got into Softa at another place and tried to set fire to the village. They were, however, driven away by the police after they had inflicted injuries on 3 or 4 men. In all, 14 persons were killed and 33 were injured. The Punjab government deputed a judicial officer to enquire into this affair. His report, which was published on 6 July, justified the action of the police in firing on the mob and recorded the opinion that there was no reason to suppose that the firing was excessive or was continued after the mob had desisted from its unlawful aggression. Had the police not opened fire, the report proceeds, their own lives would have been in immediate danger, as also the lives of the people of Softa. Lastly, in the opinion of the officer writing the report, had Softa village been sacked, there would certainly have broken up within 24 hours a terrible communal conflagration in the whole of the surrounding countryside. The riots of Kharagpur, an important railway centre not far from Calcutta, also resulted in serious loss of life. 2 riots took place at Kharagpur. The first on the occasion of the Muharram celebration at the end of June, and the second on the 1st September 1928, when the killing of a cow served as a cause. In the first riot, 15 were killed and 21 injured, while in the second riot, the casualties were 9 killed and 35 wounded. But none of these riots is to be compared with those that raged in Bombay from the beginning to the middle of February, when, as we have seen, 149 persons were killed and well over 700 injured. During the year 1929-30, communal riots, which had been so conspicuous and deplorable a feature of public life during the preceding years, were very much less frequent. Only 12 were of sufficient importance to be reported to Government of India, and of these, only the disturbances in the city of Bombay were really serious. Starting on the 23rd of April, they continued sporadically until the middle of May, and were responsible for 35 deaths and about 200 other casualties. An event which caused considerable tension in April was the murder at Lahore of Rajpal, whose pamphlet Rangila Rasool, containing a scurrilous attack on the Prophet of Islam, was responsible for much of the communal trouble in previous years, and also for a variety of legal and political complications. Fortunately, both communities showed commendable restraint at the time of the murder, and again on the occasion of the execution and funeral of the convicted man, and although feelings ran high, no serious trouble occurred. The year 1930-31 saw the eruption of the civil disobedience movement. It gave rise to riots and disturbances all over the country. They were mostly of a political character, and the parties involved in them were the police and the Congress volunteers. But, as it always happens in India, the political disturbances took a communal twist. This was due to the fact that the Muslims refused to submit to the coercive methods used by Congress volunteers to compel them to join in civil disobedience. The result was that although the year began with political riots, it ended in numerous and quite serious communal riots. The worst of these communal riots took place in and around Sukur in Sindh between the 4th and 11th of August and affected over 100 villages. The outbreak in Kishorganj subdivision of Memon Singh district, that is in Bengal, on the 12th and the 15th of July was also on a large scale. In addition, there were communal disturbances on the 3rd of August in Balia, United Provinces, on the 6th of September in Nagpur, and on the 6th, 7th September in Bombay, and a Hindu-Christian riot broke out near Tiruchendur, that is in Madras, on the 31st of October. On the 12th of February, in Amritsar, an attempt was made to murder a Hindu cloth merchant who had defied the picketers, and a similar outrage which was perpetrated the day before in Banaras had very serious consequences. On this occasion, the victim was a Muslim trader, and the attack proved fatal. As a result, since Hindu-Muslim relations throughout most of northern India were by this time very strained, a serious communal riot broke out and continued for 5 days, causing great destruction of property and numerous casualties. Among the other communal clashes during this period were the riots at Nilphamari, Bengal on the 25th of January and at Rawalpindi on the 31st. Throughout northern India, communal relations had markedly deteriorated during the first 2 months of 1931, and already in February there had been serious communal rioting in Banaras. This state of affairs was due chiefly to the increasing exasperation created among Muslims by the paralysis of trade and the general atmosphere of unrest and confusion that resulted from Congress activities. The increased importance which the Congress seemed to be acquiring as a result of the negotiations with the government aroused in the Muslims serious apprehensions and had the effect of worsening the tension between the two communities. During March, this tension in the United Provinces at any rate became greatly increased. Between the 14th and 16th, there was serious rioting in the Mirzapur district, and on the 17th, trouble broke out in Agra and continued till the 20th. There was also a communal riot in Dhanbad on the 28th and in Amritsar district on the 30th. And in many other parts of the country, the relations between members of the two communities had become extremely strained. In Assam, the communal riot which occurred at Digboi in Lakhimpur district resulted in deaths of 1 Hindu and 3 Muslims. In Bengal, a communal riot took place in the Asansol division during the Muharram festival. In Bihar and Orissa, there was a certain amount of communal tension during the year, particularly in Saran. Altogether, there were 16 cases of communal rioting and unlawful assembly. During the Bakrid festival, a clash occurred in the Bhabua subdivision of Shahabad. Some 300 Hindus collected in the mistaken belief that a cow had been sacrificed. The local officers had succeeded in pacifying them when a mob of about 200 Mohammedans armed with lathis, spears and swords attacked the Hindus, one of whom subsequently died. The prompt action of the police and the appointment of a conciliation committee prevented the spread of the trouble. The Muharram festival was marked by two small riots in Mungiar, the Hindus being the aggressors on one occasion and the Muslims on the other. In the Madras Presidency, there were also several riots of a communal nature during the year, and the relations between the two communities were in places distinctly strained. The most serious disturbance of the year occurred at Vellore on the 8th of June as a result of the passage of a Muslim procession with taziyas near a Hindu temple. So violent was the conflict between members of the two communities that the police were compelled to open fire in order to restore order, and sporadic fighting continued in the town during the next 2 or 3 days. In Salem town, owing to Hindu-Muslim tension, a dispute arose on the 13th of July as to who had been the victor at a largely attended Hindu-Muslim wrestling match at Shevapet. Another riot occurred in October at Kichipalayam near Salem town. The trouble arose from a few Muslims disturbing a street game played by some young Hindus. Hindu-Muslim disturbances also arose in Polikal village, Kurnool district, on the 15th of March owing to a dispute about the route of a Hindu procession, but the rioters were easily dispersed by a small force of police. In the Punjab, there were 907 cases of rioting during the year, as compared with 813 in 1929. Many of them were of a communal character, and the tension between the two principal communities remained acute in many parts of the province. In the United Provinces, although communal tension during 1930 was not nearly so acute as during the first 3 months of 1931, and was for a while overshadowed by the excitement engendered by the civil disobedience movement. Indications of it were fairly numerous, and the causes of disagreement remained as potent as ever. In Dehradun and Bulandshahr, there were communal riots of the usual type, and a very serious riot occurred in Balia city as a result of a dispute concerning the route taken by a Hindu procession, which necessitated firing by the police. Riots also occurred in Mutra, Azamgarh, Manpuri, and several other places. Passing on to the events of the year 1931-32, the progress of constitutional discussions at the RTC had a definite reaction in that it bred a certain nervousness among the Muslims and other minority communities as to their position under a constitution functioning on the majority principle. The first session of the Round Table Conference afforded the first close-up of the constitutional future. Until then, the ideal of dominion status had progressed little beyond a vague and general conception. But the declaration of the princes at the opening of the conference had brought responsibility at the center, in the form of a federal government within definite view. The Muslims, therefore, felt that it was high time for them to take stock of their position. This uneasiness was intensified by the Irwin Gandhi settlement, which accorded what appeared to be a privileged position to the Congress, and Congress elation and pose of victory over the government did not tend to ease Muslim misgivings. Within 3 weeks of the pact occurred the savage communal riots at Kanpur, which significantly enough began with the attempts of Congress adherents to force Mohammedan shopkeepers to observe a hartal in memory of Bhagat Singh, who was executed on 23rd March. On 24th March began the plunder of Hindu shops. On the 25th there was a blaze. Shops and temples were set fire to and burnt to cinders. Disorder, arson, loot, murder spread like wildfire. 500 families abandoned their houses and took shelter in villages. Dr. Ramchandra was one of the worst sufferers. All members of his family, including his wife and aged parents, were killed and their bodies thrown into gutters. In the same slaughter, Mr. Ganesh Shankar Vidyarthi lost his life. The Kanpur Riots Inquiry Committee in its report states that the riot was of unprecedented violence and peculiar atrocity, which spread with unexpected rapidity through the whole city and even beyond it. Murders, arson and looting were widespread for 3 days before the rioting was definitely brought under control. Afterwards, it subsided gradually. The loss of life and property was great. The number of verified deaths was 300, but the death roll is known to have been larger and was probably between 400 and 500. A large number of temples and mosques were desecrated or burnt or destroyed, and a very large number of houses were burnt and pillaged. This communal riot, which need never have occurred but for the provocative conduct of the adherents of the Congress, was the worst which India has experienced for many years. The trouble, moreover, spread from the city to the neighboring villages, where there were sporadic communal disturbances for several days afterwards. The year 1932-33 was relatively free from communal agitations and disturbances. This welcome improvement was doubtless in some measure due to the suppression of lawlessness generally and the removal of uncertainty in regard to the position of the Muslims under the new constitution. But in 1933-34, throughout the country, communal tension had been increasing, and disorders which occurred not only on the occasion of such festivals as Holi, Eid and Muharram, but also many resulting from ordinary incidents of everyday life, indicated that there had been a deterioration in communal relations since the year began. Communal riots during Holi occurred at Banaras and Kanpur in the United Provinces, at Lahore in the Punjab, and at Peshawar. Bakrid was marked by serious rioting at Ayodhya in the United Provinces over cow sacrifice, also at Bhagalpur in Bihar and Orissa, and at Kannanur in Madras. A serious riot in the Ghazipur district of the United Provinces also resulted in several deaths. During April and May, there were Hindu-Muslim riots at several places in Bihar and Orissa, in Bengal, in Sindh and Delhi, some of them provoked by very trifling incidents, as for instance, the unintentional spitting by a Muslim shopkeeper of Delhi upon a Hindu passerby. The increase in communal disputes in British India was also reflected in some of the states where similar incidents occurred. The position with regard to communal unrest during the months from June to October was indicative of the normal, deep-seated antagonism between the two major communities. June and July months, in which no Hindu or Mohammedan festival of importance took place, were comparatively free from riots, though the situation in certain areas of Bihar necessitated the quartering of additional police. A long-drawn dispute started in Agra. The Muslims of this city objected to the noise of religious ceremonies in certain Hindu private houses, which they said disturbed worshippers at prayers in a neighboring mosque. Before the dispute was settled, riots occurred on the 20th July and again on the 2nd September, in the course of which 4 persons were killed and over 80 injured. In Madras, a riot on the 3rd September, resulting in 1 death and injuries to 13 persons, was occasioned by a book published by Hindus containing alleged reflections on the Prophet. During the same month, minor riots occurred in several places in the Punjab and the United Provinces. In 1934-35, serious trouble arose in Lahore on the 29th of June, as a result of a dispute between Muslims and Sikhs about a mosque situated within the precincts of a Sikh temple known as the Shahid Ganj Gurdwara. Trouble had been brewing for some time. Ill feeling became intensified when the Sikhs started to demolish the mosque despite Muslim protests. The building had been the subject of prolonged litigation, which has confirmed the Sikh right of possession. On the night of the 29th June, a crowd of 3,000 or 4,000 Muslims assembled in front of the Gurdwara. A struggle between this crowd and the Sikhs inside the Gurdwara was only averted by the prompt action of the local authorities. They subsequently obtained an undertaking from the Sikhs to refrain from further demolition. But during the following week, while strenuous efforts were being made to persuade the leaders to reach an amicable settlement, the Sikhs, under pressure of extremist influence, again set about demolishing the mosque. This placed the authorities in a most difficult position. The Sikhs were acting within their legal rights. Moreover, the only effective method of stopping demolition would have been to resort to firing. As the building was full of Sikhs and was within the precincts of a Sikh place of worship, this would not only have caused much bloodshed, but for religious reasons would have had serious reactions on the Sikh population throughout the province. On the other hand, inaction by government was bound to cause great indignation among the Muslims for religious reasons, and it was expected that this would show itself in sporadic attacks on the Sikhs and perhaps on the forces of government. It was hoped that discussions between leaders of the two communities would effect some reapproachment, but mischief makers inflamed the minds of their co-religionists. Despite the arrest of the chief offenders, the excitement increased. The government's gesture in offering to restore to the Muslims another mosque, which they had purchased years ago, proved unavailing. The situation took a further turn for the worse on the 19th July, and during the following 2 days, the situation was acutely dangerous. The central police station was practically besieged by the huge crowds, which assumed a most menacing attitude. Repeated attempts to disperse them without the use of firearms failed, and the troops had to fire twice on the 20th July and 8 times on the 21st. In all, 23 rounds were fired and 12 persons killed. Casualties, mostly of a minor nature, were numerous amongst the military and police. As a result of the firing, the crowds dispersed and did not reassemble. Extra police were brought in from other provinces and the military garrisons were strengthened. Administrative control was re-established rapidly, but the religious leaders continued to fan the embers of the agitation. Civil litigation was renewed and certain Muslim organizations framed some extravagant demands. The situation in Lahore continued to cause anxiety up to the close of the year. On the 6th November, a Sikh was mortally wounded by a Muslim. 3 days later, a huge Sikh Hindu procession was taken out. The organizers appeared anxious to avoid conflict, but nonetheless one serious clash occurred. This was followed by further rioting on the next day. But for the good work of the police and the troops, in breaking up the fights quickly, the casualties might have been very large. On the 19th March 1935, a serious incident occurred in Karachi after the execution of Abdul Qayyum, the Muslim who had murdered Nathuram Lal, a Hindu already referred to as the writer of a scurrilous pamphlet about the Prophet. Abdul Qayyum's body was taken by the district magistrate, accompanied by a police party, to be handed over to the deceased family for burial outside the city. A huge crowd, estimated to be about 25,000 strong, collected at the place of burial. Though the relatives of Abdul Qayyum wished to complete the burial at the cemetery, the most violent members of the mob determined to take the body in procession through the city. The local authorities decided to prevent the mob entering, since this would have led to communal rioting. All attempts of the police to stop the procession failed, so a platoon of the Royal Sussex Regiment was brought in to keep peace. It was forced to open fire at short range to stop the advance of the frenzied mob and to prevent itself from being overwhelmed. 47 rounds were fired, by which 47 people were killed and 134 injured. The arrival of reinforcements prevented further attempts to advance. The wounded were taken to the civil hospital, and the body of Abdul Qayyum was then interred without further trouble. On the 25th August 1935, there was a communal riot at Sikandarabad. In the year 1936, there were 4 communal riots. On the 14th April, there occurred a most terrible riot at Firozabad in the Agra district. A Muslim procession was proceeding along the main bazaar, and it is alleged that bricks were thrown from the roofs of Hindu houses. This enraged the Muslims in the procession, who set fire to the house of a Hindu, Dr. Jiva Ram, and the adjacent temple of Radha Krishna. The inmates of Dr. Jiva Ram's house, in addition to 11 Hindus, including 3 children, were burned to death. A second Hindu-Muslim riot broke out in Pune, in the Bombay Presidency, on 24th April 1936. On the 27th April, there occurred a Hindu-Muslim riot in Jamalpur in the Mongia district. The 4th Hindu-Muslim riot of the year took place in Bombay on the 15th October 1936. The year 1937 was full of communal disturbances. On the 27th March 1937, there was a Hindu-Muslim riot at Panipat over the holy procession, and 14 persons were killed. On the 1st May 1937, there occurred a communal riot in Madras in which 50 persons were injured. The month of May was full of communal riots which took place mostly in the CP and the Punjab. One that took place in Shikarpur in Sindh caused great panic. On 18th June, there was a Sikh Muslim riot in Amritsar. It assumed such proportions that British troops had to be called out to maintain order. The year 1938 was marked by 2 communal riots, one in Allahabad on 26th March and another in Bombay in April. There were 6 Hindu-Muslim riots in 1939. On the 21st January, there was a riot at Asansol, in which 1 was killed and 18 injured. It was followed by a riot in Kanpur on the 11th February, in which 42 were killed, 200 injured and 800 arrested. On the 4th March, there was a riot at Banaras, followed by a riot at Kashipur near Calcutta on the 5th March. On 19th June, there was again a riot at Kanpur over the Rath Jatra procession. A serious riot occurred on 20th November 1939 in Sukur in Sindh. The riot was the culmination of the agitation by the Muslims to take possession, even by force, of a building called Manzilgah, which was in the possession of government as government property, and to the transfer of which the Hindus had raised objections. Mr. E. Weston, now a judge of the Bombay High Court, who was appointed to investigate into the disturbances, gives these figures of the murdered and the wounded. Reference to Report of the Court of Enquiry appointed under Section 3 of the Sindh Public Enquiries Act to enquire into the riots which occurred at Sukur in 1939, page 65. The total of 142 Hindus under murdered seems to be a mistake. It ought to be 72. Reference over. The table is divided into 4 columns. The first column is Taluka. Second column is murders committed. Third column is persons injured. And fourth column is persons subsequently died from injuries. All these columns are divided into 2 sub-columns, Hindus and Muslims. I shall now read the table. Taluka, Sukur town, murders committed, Hindus 20, Mohammedans 12. Persons injured, Hindus 11, Mohammedans 11. Persons subsequently died from injuries, Hindus 1, Mohammedans 0. Sukur Taluka, murders committed, Hindus 2, Mohammedans 2. Persons injured, Hindus 23, Mohammedans 0. Persons subsequently died from injuries, Hindus 5, Mohammedans 0. Shikarpur Taluka, murders committed, Hindus 5, Mohammedans 0. Persons injured, Hindus 11, Mohammedans 0. Persons subsequently died from injuries, Hindus 2, Mohammedans 0. Garhi Yasin Taluka, murders committed, Hindus 24, Mohammedans 0. Persons injured, Hindus 4, Mohammedans 0. Persons subsequently died from injuries, Hindus 0, Mohammedans 0. Rohri Taluka, murders committed, Hindus 10, Mohammedans 0. Persons injured, Hindus 3, Mohammedans 0. Persons subsequently died from injuries, Hindus 0, Mohammedans 0. Pano Akil Taluka, murders committed, Hindus 6, Mohammedans 0. Persons injured, Hindus 1, Mohammedans 0. Persons subsequently died from injuries, Hindus 0, Mohammedans 0. Ghorki Taluka, murders committed, Hindus 1, Mohammedans 0. Persons injured, Hindus 1, Mohammedans 0. Persons subsequently died from injuries, Hindus 0, Mohammedans 0. Mirpur Machalo Taluka, murders committed, Hindus 0, Mohammedans 0. Persons injured, Hindus 1, Mohammedans 0. Persons subsequently died from injuries, Hindus 0, Mohammedans 0. Obauro Taluka, murders committed, Hindus 4, Mohammedans 0. Persons injured, Hindus 3, Mohammedans 1. Persons subsequently died from injuries, Hindus 1, Mohammedan 0. Total murders committed, Hindus 142, Mohammedans 14. Persons injured, Hindus 58, Mohammedans 12. Persons subsequently died from injuries, Hindus 9, Mohammedans 0. Table over. Of the many gruesome incidents recorded by him, this may be quoted. Inverted comma begins. The most terrible of all the disturbances occurred on the night of the 20th at Gosarji village, which is 8 miles from Sukur and 16 from Shikarpur. According to an early statement sent by the district magistrate to government, admittedly incomplete, 27 Hindus were murdered there that night. According to the witnesses examined, the number was 37. Paman Mal, a contractor of Gosarji, states that at the time of Satyagrah, the leading Hindus of Gosarji came in deputation to the leading zamindar of the locality, Khan Sahib Amir Baksh, who was then at Sukur. He reassured them and said he was responsible for their safety. On the 20th, Khan Sahib Amir Baksh was at Gosarji, and that morning Mukhi Mahurmal was murdered there. The Hindus went to Khan Sahib Amir Baksh for protection and were again reassured, but that night wholesale murder and looting took place. Of the 37 murdered, 7 were women. Paman Mal states that the following morning he went to the sub-inspector of Bagarji, which is 1 mile from Gosarji, but he was abused and driven from the Thana. He then went to Shikarpur and complained to the Panchayat, but did not complain to any officer there. I may mention that the sub-inspector of Bagarji was afterwards prosecuted under Section 211 Indian Penal Code and has been convicted for failure to make arrests in connection with murders at Gosarji. As Khan Sahib Amir Baksh, the zamindar, who was said to have given assurance of protection to the Hindus of Bagarji, was reported to be attending the court, he was called and examined as a court witness. He states that he lives half a mile from Gosarji village. The sub-inspector of Bagarji came to Gosarji on the 20th after the murder of Makrumal, and he acted as a mashir. He says that the Hindus did not ask for help and there was no apprehension of trouble. On the night of the 20th, he was not well and he heard nothing of the murders. He admits that he had heard of the Manzilga evacuation. Later in his evidence, he admits that he told the villagers of Gosarji to be on the alert as there was trouble in Sukur, and he says he had called the Panchayat on the evening of the 19th. He went to Gosarji at sunrise on the 21st after the murders. He admits that he is regarded as the protector of Gosarji. Inverted comma closed. Mr. Weston adds, reference to IBID, page 66 to 67. Inverted comma begins, I find it impossible to believe the evidence of this witness. I have no doubt that he was fully aware that there was trouble in Gosarji on the night of 20th and preferred to remain in his house. Inverted comma closed. Who can deny this record of writing presents a picture which is grim in its results and somber in its tone. But being chronological in order, the record might fail to give an idea of the havoc these riots have caused in any given province and the paralysis it has brought about in its social and economic life. To give an idea of the paralysis caused by the recurrence of riots in a province, I have recast the record of riots for the province of Bombay. When recast, the general picture appears like this. Leaving aside the presidency and confining oneself to the city of Bombay, there can be no doubt that the record of the city is the blackest. The first Hindu-Muslim riot took place in 1893. This was followed by a long period of communal peace which lasted up to 1929. But the years that have followed have an appalling story to tell. From February 1929 to April 1938, a period of 9 years, there were no less than 10 communal riots. In 1929, there were 2 communal riots. In the first, 149 were killed and 739 were injured, and it lasted for 36 days. In the second riot, 35 were killed, 109 were injured, and it continued for 22 days. In 1930, there were 2 riots. Details as to loss of life and its duration are not available. In 1932, there were again 2 riots. The first was a small one. In the second, 217 were killed, 2,713 were injured, and it went on for 49 days. In 1933, there was 1 riot, details about which are not available. In 1933, there was 1 riot, details about which are not available. In 1936, there was 1 riot in which 94 were killed, 632 were injured, and it continued to rage for 65 days. In the riot of 1937, 11 were killed, 85 were injured, and it occupied 21 days. The riot of 1938 lasted for 2.5 hours only, but within that time, 12 were killed and a little over 100 were injured. Taking the total period of 9 years and 2 months from February 1929 to April 1938, the Hindus and Muslims of the city of Bombay alone were engaged in a sanguinary warfare for 210 days, during which period 550 were killed and 4,500 were wounded. This does not, of course, take into consideration the loss of property which took place through arson and loot. Part 5. Such is the record of Hindu-Muslim relationship from 1920 to 1940, placed side by side with the frantic efforts made by Mr. Gandhi to bring about Hindu-Muslim unity. The record makes most painful and heart-rending reading. It would not be much exaggeration to say that it is a record of 20 years of civil war between the Hindus and the Muslims in India, interrupted by brief intervals of armed peace. In this civil war, men were, of course, the principal victims, but women did not altogether escape molestation. It is perhaps not sufficiently known how much women have suffered in communal hostilities. Data relating to the whole of India are not available, but some data relating to Bengal exists. On the 6th September 1932, questions were asked in the Old Bengal Legislative Council regarding the abduction of women in the province of Bengal. In reply, the government of the day stated that between 1922 to 1927, the total number of women abducted was 568. Of these, 101 were unmarried and 467 were married. Asked to state the community to which the abducted women belonged, it was disclosed that out of 101 unmarried women, 64 were Hindus, 29 Muslims, 4 Christians, and 4 nondescript, and that out of 467 married women, 331 were Hindus, 122 Muslims, 2 Christians, and 12 nondescript. These figures relate to cases which were reported, or if reported, were not detected. Usually, about 10% of the cases are reported or detected, and 90% go undetected. Applying this proportion to the facts disclosed by the Bengal government, it may be said that about 35,000 women were abducted in Bengal during the short period of 5 years between 1922 to 27. The attitude towards women folk is a good index of the friendly or unfriendly attitude between the two communities. As such, the case which happened on 27 June 1936 in the village of Govindpur in Bengal makes very instructive reading. The account of it is taken from the opening speech of the Crown Council when the trial of 40 Mohammedan accused began on the 10th August 1936. Reference to: this is an English version of the report which appeared in the Savdhan, a Marathi weekly of Nagpur, in its issue of 25th August 1936. Reference over. According to the prosecution, inverted comma begins, there lived in Govindpur a Hindu by name Radha Vallabh. He had a son Harendra. There lived also in Govindpur a Muslim woman whose occupation was to sell milk. The local Musalmans of the village suspected that Harendra had illicit relationship with this Muslim milk woman. They resented that a Muslim woman should be in the keeping of a Hindu, and they decided to wreak their vengeance on the family of Radha Vallabh for this insult. A meeting of the Musalmans of Govindpur was convened, and Harendra was summoned to attend this meeting. Soon after Harendra went to the meeting, cries of Harendra were heard. It was found that Harendra was assaulted and was lying senseless in the field where the meeting was held. The Musalmans of Govindpur were not satisfied with this assault. They informed Radha Vallabh that unless he, his wife, and his children embraced Islam, the Musalmans did not feel satisfied for the wrong his son had done to them. Radha Vallabh was planning to send away to another place his wife and children. The Musalmans came to know this plan. Next day, when Kusum, the wife of Radha Vallabh, was sweeping the courtyard of her house, some Mohammedans came, held down Radha Vallabh, and some spirited away Kusum. After having taken her to some distance, 2 Mohammedans by name Lakar and Mahazar raped her and removed her ornaments. After some time, she came to her senses and ran towards her home. Her assailants again pursued her. She succeeded in reaching her home and locking herself in. Her Muslim assailants broke open the door, caught hold of her, and again carried her away on the road. It was suggested by her assailants that she should be again raped on the street. But with the help of another woman by name Rajni, Kusum escaped and took shelter in the house of Rajni. While she was in the house of Rajni, the Musalmans of Govindpur paraded her husband Radha Vallabh in the streets in complete disgrace. Next day, the Musalmans kept watch on the roads to and from Govindpur to the police station to prevent Radha Vallabh and Kusum from giving information of the outrage to the police. Inverted comma closed. These acts of barbarism against women, committed without remorse, without shame, and without condemnation by their fellow brethren, show the depth of the antagonism which divided the two communities. The tempers on each side were the tempers of two warring nations. There was carnage, pillage, sacrilege, and outrage of every species perpetrated by Hindus against Musalmans and by Musalmans against Hindus, more perhaps by Musalmans against Hindus than by Hindus against Musalmans. Cases of arson have occurred in which Musalmans have set fire to the houses of Hindus, in which whole families of Hindus, men, women, and children, were roasted alive and consumed in the fire to the great satisfaction of the Muslim spectators. What is astonishing is that these cold and deliberate acts of rank cruelty were not regarded as atrocities to be condemned, but was treated as legitimate acts of warfare for which no apology was necessary. Enraged by these hostilities, the editor of the Hindustan, a Congress paper, writing in 1926, used this language to express the painful truth of the utter failure of Mr. Gandhi's efforts to bring about Hindu-Muslim unity. In words of utter despair, the editor said, reference quoted in Through Indian Eyes, columns of the Times of India, dated 16/8/26. There is an immense distance between the India of today and India a nation, between an uncouth reality which expresses itself in murder and arson, and that fond fiction which is in the imagination of patriotic, if self-deceiving men. To talk about Hindu-Muslim unity from 1,000 platforms, or to give it blazoning headlines, is to perpetrate an illusion whose cloudy structure dissolves itself at the exchange of brickbats and the desecration of tombs and temples. To sing a few pious hymns of peace and goodwill a la Naidu will not benefit the country. The President of the Congress has been improvising on the theme of Hindu-Muslim unity, so dear to her heart, with brilliant variations, which does credit to her genius, but leaves the problem untouched. The millions in India can only respond when the unity song is not only on the tongues of the leaders, but in the hearts of the millions of their countrymen. Inverted comma closed. Nothing I could say can so well show the futility of any hope of Hindu-Muslim unity. Hindu-Muslim unity up to now was at least in sight, although it was like a mirage. Today it is out of sight and also out of mind. Even Mr. Gandhi has given up what he perhaps now realizes is an impossible task. But there are others who, notwithstanding the history of the past 20 years, believe in the possibility of Hindu-Muslim unity. This belief of theirs seems to rest on two grounds. Firstly, they believe in the efficacy of a central government to mold diverse set of people into one nation. Secondly, they feel that the satisfaction of Muslim demands will be a sure means of achieving Hindu-Muslim unity. It is true that government is a unifying force and that there are many instances where diverse people have become unified into one homogeneous people by reason of their being subjected to a single government. But the Hindus who are depending upon government as a unifying force seem to forget that there are obvious limits to government acting as a unifying force. The limits to government working as a unifying force are set by the possibilities of fusion among the people. In a country where race, language, and religion do not stand in the way of fusion, government is most effective as a unifying force. On the other hand, in a country where race, language, and religion put an effective bar against fusion, government can have no effect as a unifying force. If the diverse people in France, England, Italy, and Germany became unified nations by reason of a common government, it was because neither race, language, nor religion obstructed the unifying process of government. On the other hand, if the people in Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Turkey failed to be unified, although under a common government, it was because race, language, and religion was strong enough to counter and nullify the unifying power of the government. No one can deny that race, language, and religion have been too dominant in India to permit the people of India to be welded into a nation by the unifying force of a common government. It is an illusion to say that the central government in India has molded the Indian people into a nation. What the central government has done is to tie them together by one law and to house them together in one place as the owner of unruly animals does, by tying them with one rope and keeping them in one stable. All that the central government has done is to produce a kind of peace among Indians. It has not made them one nation. It cannot be said that time has been too short for unification to take place. If 150 years of life under a central government does not suffice, eternity will not suffice. For this failure, The genius of the Indians alone is responsible. There is among Indians no passion for unity, no desire for fusion. There is no desire to have a common dress. There is no desire to have a common language. There is no will to give up what is local and particular for something which is common and national. A Gujarati takes pride in being a Gujarati, a Maharashtrian in being a Maharashtrian, a Punjabi in being a Punjabi, a Madrasi in being a Madrasi, and a Bengali in being a Bengali. Such is the mentality of Hindus who accuse the Mussalman of want of national feeling when he says, "I am a Mussalman first and Indian afterwards." Can anyone suggest that there exists anywhere in India, even among the Hindus, an instinct or a passion that would put any semblance of emotion behind their declaration, civis Indianus sum, or the smallest consciousness of a moral and social unity, which desires to give expression by sacrificing whatever is particular and local in favor of what is common and unifying? There is no such consciousness and no such desire. Without such consciousness and no such desire, to depend upon government to bring about unification is to deceive oneself. Regarding the second, it was no doubt the opinion of the Simon Commission, inverted comma begins, that the communal rights were a manifestation of the anxieties and ambitions aroused in both the communities by the prospects of India's political future. So long as authority was firmly established in British hands and self-government was not thought of, Hindu-Muslim rivalry was confined within a narrower field. This was not merely because the presence of a neutral bureaucracy discouraged strife. A further reason was that there was little for members of one community to fear from the predominance of the other. The comparative absence of communal strife in the Indian states today may be similarly explained. Many who are well acquainted with conditions in British India a generation ago would testify that at that epoch so much good feeling had been engendered between the two sides that communal tension as a threat to civil peace was at a minimum. But the coming of the reforms and the anticipation of what may follow them have given new point to Hindu-Muslim competition. The one community naturally lays claim to the rights of a majority and relies upon its qualifications of better education and greater wealth. The other is all the more determined on those accounts to secure effective protection for its members and does not forget that it represents the previous conquerors of the country. It wishes to be assured of adequate representation and of a full share of official posts. Inverted comma closed. Assuming that to be a true diagnosis, assuming that Muslim demands are reasonable, assuming that the Hindus were prepared to grant them, and these are all very big assumptions, it is a question whether a true union between Hindus and Muslims can take place through political unity, resulting from the satisfaction of Muslim political demands. Some people seem to think that it is enough if there is a political unity between Hindus and Muslims. I think this is the greatest delusion. Those who take this view seem to be thinking only of how to bring the Muslims to join the Hindus in their demands on the British for dominion status or independence as the mood of the moment be. This, to say the least, is a very short-sighted view. How to make the Muslims join the Hindus in the latter's demands on the British is comparatively a very small question. In what spirit will they work the constitution? Will they work it only as aliens by an unwanted tie, or will they work it as true kindreds, is the more important question. For working it as true kindreds, what is wanted is not merely political unity, but a true union of heart and soul. In other words, social unity. Political unity is worth nothing if it is not the expression of real union. It is as precarious as the unity between persons who, without being friends, become allies of each other. How very precarious it always is best illustrated by what has happened between Germany and Russia. Personally, I do not think that a permanent union can be made to depend upon the satisfaction of mere material interests. Pacts may produce unity, but that unity can never ripen into union. A pact as a basis for a union is worse than useless. As its very nature indicates, a pact is separative in character. A pact cannot produce the desire to accommodate. It cannot instill the spirit of sacrifice, nor can it bind the parties to the main objective. Instead of accommodating each other, parties to a pact strive to get as much as possible out of each other. Instead of sacrificing for the common cause, parties to the pact are constantly occupied in seeing that the sacrifice made by one is not used for the good of the other. Instead of fighting for the main objective, parties to the pact are forever engaged in seeing that in the struggle for reaching the goal, the balance of power between the parties is not disturbed. Renan spoke the most profound truth when he said, "Community of interests is assuredly a powerful bond between men, but nevertheless can interests suffice to make a nation? I do not believe it. Community of interests makes commercial treaties. There is a sentimental side to nationality. It is at once body and soul. A Zolovarine is not a fatherland." Equally striking is the view of James Bryce, another well-known student of history. According to Bryce, "the permanence of an institution depends not merely on the material interests that support it, but on its conformity to the deep-rooted sentiment of the men for whom it has been made. When it draws to itself and provides a fitting expression for that sentiment, the sentiment becomes thereby not only more vocal but actually stronger, and in its turn imparts a fuller vitality to the institution." These observations of Bryce were made in connection with the foundation of the German Empire by Bismarck, who, according to Bryce, succeeded in creating a durable empire because it was based on a sentiment and that this sentiment was fostered. "Most of all by what we call the instinct or passion for nationality, the desire of a people already conscious of a moral and social unity, to see such unity expressed and realized under a single government, which shall give it a place and name among civilized states." What is it that produces this moral and social unity which gives permanence, and what is it that drives people to see such unity expressed and realized under a single government, which shall give it a place and a name among civilized states? No one is more competent to answer this question than James Bryce. It was just such a question he had to consider in discussing the vitality of the Holy Roman Empire as contrasted with the Roman Empire. If any empire can be said to have succeeded in bringing about political unity among its diverse subjects, it was the Roman Empire. Paraphrasing for the sake of brevity the language of Bryce, the gradual extension of Roman citizenship through the founding of colonies, first throughout Italy and then in the provinces, the working of the equalized and equalizing Roman law, the even pressure of the government on all subjects, the movements of population caused by commerce and the slave traffic were steadily assimilating the various peoples. Emperors, who were for the most part natives of the provinces, cared little to cherish Italy, or even after the days of the Antonines, to conciliate Rome. It was their policy to keep open for every subject a career by whose freedom they had themselves risen to greatness. Annihilating distinctions of legal status among freemen, it completed the work which trade and literature and toleration to all beliefs but one were already performing. No quarrel of race or religions disturbed that calm, for all national distinctions were becoming merged in the idea of a common empire. This unity produced by the Roman Empire was only a political unity. How long did this political unity last? In the words of Bryce, inverted comma begins, scarcely had these slowly working influences brought about this unity, when other influences began to threaten it. New foes assailed the frontiers, while the loosening of the structure within was shown by the long struggles for power which followed the death or deposition of each successive emperor. In the period of anarchy, after the fall of Valerian, generals were raised by their armies in every part of the empire and ruled great provinces as monarchs apart, owning no allegiance to the possessor of the capital. The breaking up of the western half of the empire into separate kingdoms might have been anticipated by 200 years, had there not arisen in Diocletian a prince active and skillful enough to bind up the fragments before they had lost all cohesion, meeting altered conditions by new remedies. The policy he adopted by dividing and localizing authority recognized the fact that the weakened heart could no longer make its pulsations felt to the body's extremities. He parcelled out the supreme power among 4 monarchs, ruling as joint emperors in 4 capitals, and then sought to give it a fictitious strength by surrounding it with an oriental pomp which his earlier predecessors would have scorned. The prerogative of Rome was menaced by the rivalry of Nicomedia and the nearer greatness of Milan. Inverted comma, closed. It is therefore evident that political unity was not enough to give permanence and stability to the Roman Empire, and as Bryce points out, that the breaking up of the western half of the Roman Empire into separate kingdoms might have been anticipated by 200 years, had the barbarian tribes on the border been bolder, or had there not arisen in Diocletian a prince active and skillful enough to bind up the fragments before they had lost all cohesion, meeting altered conditions by new remedies. But the fact is that the Roman Empire, which was tottering and breaking into bits, and whose political unity was not enough to bind it together, did last for several hundred years as one cohesive unit after it became the Holy Roman Empire. As Professor Marvin points out, reference to The Unity of Western Civilization, 4th edition, page 27. Inverted comma begins, the unity of the Roman Empire was mainly political and military. It lasted for between 400 and 500 years. The unity which supervened in the Catholic Church was religious and moral, and endured for 1,000 years. Inverted comma, closed. The question is, what made the Holy Roman Empire more stable than the Roman Empire could ever hope to be? According to Bryce, it was a common religion in the shape of Christianity and a common religious organization in the shape of the Christian Church, which supplied the cement to the Holy Roman Empire and which was wanting in the Roman Empire. It was this cement which gave to the people of the empire a moral and social unity and made them see such unity expressed and realized under a single government. Speaking of the unifying effect of Christianity as a common religion, Bryce says, inverted comma begins, "It is on religion that the inmost and deepest life of a nation rests. Because divinity was divided, humanity had been divided. Likewise, the doctrine of the unity of God now enforced the unity of man, who had been created in his image. The first lesson of Christianity was love, a love that was to join in one body those whom suspicion and prejudice and pride of race had hitherto kept apart. There was thus formed by the new religion a community of the faithful, a holy empire designed to gather all men into its bosom and standing opposed to the manifold polytheisms of the older world, exactly as the universal sway of the Caesars was contrasted with the innumerable kingdoms and city republics that had gone before it." Inverted comma closed. Reference: The Christian Church did not play a passive part in the process of unification of the Holy Roman Empire. It took a very active part in bringing it about, seeing one institution after another falling to pieces around her, seeing how countries and cities were being severed from each other by the irruption of strange tribes and the increasing difficulty of communication. The Christian Church, says Bryce, strove to save religious fellowship by strengthening the ecclesiastical organization, by drawing tighter every bond of outward union. Necessities of faith were still more powerful. Truth, it was said, is one, and as it must bind into one body all who hold it, so it is only by continuing in that body that they can preserve it. There is one flock and one shepherd. Reference over. If what Bryce has said regarding the instability of the Roman Empire and the comparatively greater stability of its successor, the Holy Roman Empire, has any lesson for India, and if the reasoning of Bryce, that the Roman Empire was unstable because it had nothing more than political unity to rely on, and that the Holy Roman Empire was more stable because it rested on the secure foundation of moral and social unity produced by the possession of a common faith, is valid reasoning and embodies human experience, then it is obvious that there can be no possibility of a union between Hindus and Muslims. The cementing force of a common religion is wanting. From a spiritual point of view, Hindus and Muslims are not merely two classes or two sects such as Protestants and Catholics or Shaivas and Vaishnavas. They are two distinct species. In this view, neither the Hindu nor the Muslim can be expected to recognize that humanity is an essential quality present in them both, and that they are not many but one, and that the differences between them are no more than accidents. For them, divinity is divided, and with the division of divinity, their humanity is divided, and with the division of humanity, they must remain divided. There is nothing to bring them in one bosom. Without social union, political unity is difficult to be achieved. If achieved, it would be as precarious as a summer sapling, liable to be uprooted by the gust of a hostile wind. With mere political unity, India may be a state, but to be a state is not to be a nation, and a state which is not a nation has small prospects of survival in the struggle for existence. This is especially true where nationalism, the most dynamic force of modern times, is seeking everywhere to free itself by the destruction and disruption of all mixed states. The danger to a mixed and composite state therefore lies not so much in external aggression as in the internal resurgence of nationalities which are fragmented, entrapped, suppressed, and held against their will. Those who oppose Pakistan should not only bear this danger in mind, but should also realize that this attempt on the part of suppressed nationalities to disrupt a mixed state and to find a separate home for themselves, instead of being condemned, finds ethical justification from the principle of self-determination. Chapter 8: Muslim Alternative to Pakistan. The Hindus say they have an alternative to Pakistan. Have the Muslims also an alternative to Pakistan? The Hindus say yes, the Muslims say no. The Hindus believe that the Muslim proposal for Pakistan is only a bargaining maneuver put forth with the object of making additions to the communal gains already secured under the communal award. The Muslims repudiate the suggestion. They say there is no equivalent to Pakistan, and therefore they will have Pakistan and nothing but Pakistan. It does seem that the Muslims are devoted to Pakistan and are determined to have nothing else, and that the Hindus, in hoping for an alternative, are merely indulging in wishful thinking. But assuming that the Hindus are shrewd enough in divining what the Muslim game is, will the Hindus be ready to welcome the Muslim alternative to Pakistan? The answer to the question must of course depend upon what the Muslim alternative is. What is the Muslim alternative to Pakistan? No one knows. The Muslims, if they have any, have not disclosed it, and perhaps will not disclose it till the day when the rival parties meet to revise and settle the terms on which the Hindus and the Muslims are to associate with each other in future. To be forewarned is to be forearmed. It is therefore necessary for the Hindus to have some idea of the possible Muslim alternative to enable them to meet the shock of it, for the alternative cannot be better than the communal award and is sure to be many degrees worse. In the absence of the exact alternative proposal, one can only make a guess. Now one man's guess is as good as that of another, and the party concerned has to choose on which of these he will rely. Among the likely guesses, my guess is that the Muslims will put forth as their alternative some such proposal as these: that the future constitution of India shall provide 1. That the Muslims shall have 50% representation in the legislature, central as well as provincial, through separate electorates. 2. That 50% of the executive in the centre as well as in the provinces shall consist of Muslims. 3. That in the civil service 50% of the posts shall be assigned to the Muslims. 4. That in the fighting forces the Muslim proportion shall be 1/2, both in the ranks and in the higher grades. 5. That Muslims shall have 50% representation in all public bodies such as councils and commissions created for public purposes. 6. That Muslims shall have 50% representation in all international organizations in which India will participate. 7. That if the Prime Minister be a Hindu, the Deputy Prime Minister shall be a Muslim. 8. That if the Commander-in-Chief be a Hindu, the Deputy Commander-in-Chief shall be a Muslim. 9. That no changes in the provincial boundaries shall be made except with the consent of 66% of the Muslim members of the legislature. 10. That no action or treaty against a Muslim country shall be valid unless the consent of 66% of the Muslim members of the legislature is obtained. 11. That no law affecting the culture or religion or religious usage of Muslims shall be made except with the consent of 66% of the Muslim members of the legislature. 12. that the national language for India shall be Urdu. 13. That no law prohibiting or restricting the slaughter of cows or the propagation of and conversion to Islam shall be valid unless it is passed with the consent of 66% of the Muslim members of the legislature. 14. That no change in the constitution shall be valid unless the majority required for effecting such changes also includes a 66% majority of the Muslim members of the legislature. This guess of mine is not the result of imagination let loose. It is not the result of a desire to frighten the Hindus into an unwilling and hasty acceptance of Pakistan. If I may say so, it is really an intelligent anticipation based upon available data coming from Muslim quarters. An indication of what the Muslim alternative is likely to be is obtainable from the nature of the constitutional reforms which are contemplated for the dominions of His Exalted Highness the Nizam of Hyderabad. The Hyderabad scheme of reforms is a novel scheme. It rejects the scheme of communal representation obtaining in British India. In its place is substituted what is called functional representation, that is, representation by classes and by professions. The composition of the legislature, which is to consist of 70 members, is to be as such. There is a table which is divided into two columns. The first column is elected and the second column is nominated. I shall now read the table. Column 1, elected. Agriculture, total number 12, out of which patidars are 8 and tenants are 4. Women 1, graduates 1, university 1, jagirdars 2, mashdars 1, legal 2, medical 2, out of which Western 1, Oriental 1, teaching 1, commerce 1, industries 2, banking 2, out of which indigenous is 1 and cooperative and joint stock 1, organized labor 1, Harijan 1, district municipalities 1, city municipality 1, rural boards 1. Column 2, nominated. Ilakas 8, out of which Surfi Khas 2, Paigas 3, Peshkari 1, Salarjung 1, Samsthans 1. Officials 18, rural arts and crafts 1, backward classes 1, minor unrepresented 3, classes and others 6. Total number of elected members is 33 and total number of nominated members is 37. Table over. Whether the scheme of functional representation will promote better harmony between the various classes and sections than communal representation does is more than doubtful. In addition to perpetuating existing social and religious divisions, it may quite easily intensify class struggle by emphasizing class consciousness. The scheme appears innocuous, but its real character will come out when every class will demand representation in proportion to its numbers. Be that as it may, functional representation is not the most significant feature of the Hyderabad scheme of reforms. The most significant feature of the scheme is the proposed division of seats between Hindus and Muslims in the new Hyderabad legislature. Under the scheme as approved by HEH, the Nizam, communal representation is not altogether banished. It is retained along with functional representation. It is to operate through joint electorates, but there is to be equal representation for the two majority communities on every elective body, including the legislature, and no candidate can succeed unless he secures 40% of the votes polled by members of his community. This principle of equal representation to Hindus and Muslims, irrespective of their numbers, is not only to apply to every elective body, but it is to apply to both elected as well as nominated members of the body. Reference 1. Besides the central legislature, there are to be constituted under the scheme of reforms other popular bodies such as panchayats, rural boards, municipalities and town committees. Reference 2. The distribution of population of Hyderabad state, excluding Berar, is according to the census of 1931 as Hindus 96,99,615, untouchables 24,73,230, Muslims 15,34,666, Christians 1,51,382, others 5,77,255, total 1,44,36,148. Reference over. In justification of this theory of equal representation, it is stated that, inverted comma begins, the importance of the Muslim community in the state by virtue of its historical position and its status in the body politic is so obvious that it cannot be reduced to the status of a minority in the assembly, inverted comma closed. Quite recently, there have appeared in the press the proposals formulated by one Mr. Mir Akbar Ali Khan, calling himself the leader of the Nationalist Party, as a means of settling the Hindu-Muslim problem in British India. Reference to See Bombay Sentinel, June 22, 1940. Mr. Mir Akbar Ali Khan says that he discussed his proposals with Mr. Srinivas Iyengar, ex-president of the Congress, and the proposals published by him are really proposals as approved by Mr. Iyengar. Reference over. They are 1. The future Constitution of India must rest upon the broad foundation of adequate military defense of the country and upon making the people reasonable military-minded. The Hindus must have the same military-mindedness as the Muslims. 2. The present moment offers a supreme opportunity for the two communities to ask for the defense of India being made over to them. The Indian army must consist of an equal numbers of Hindus and Muslims, and no regiment should be on a communal as distinguished from regional basis. 3. The governments in the provinces and at the center should be wholly national governments composed of men who are reasonable military-minded. Hindu and Muslim ministers should be equal in number in the central as well as all provincial cabinets. Other important minorities might, wherever necessary, be given special representation. This scheme will function most satisfactorily with joint electorates, but in the present temper of the country, separate electorates might be continued. The Hindu ministers must be elected by the Hindu members of the legislature and the Muslim ministers by the Muslim members. 4. The cabinet is to be removable only on an express vote of no confidence against the cabinet as a whole, passed by a majority of 2/3 of the whole house, which majority must be of Hindus and Muslims taken separately. 5. The religion, language, script, and personal law of each community should be safeguarded by a paramount constitutional check, enabling the majority of members representing that community in the legislature to place a veto on any legislative or other measures affecting it. A similar veto must be provided against any measure designed or calculated to affect adversely the economic well-being of any community. 6. An adequate communal representation in the services must be agreed to as a practical measure of justice in administration and in the distribution patronage. If the proposals put forth by a Muslim leader of the Nationalist Party in Hyderabad state is an indication of the direction in which the mind of the Muslims in British India is running, then the guess I have made as to what is likely to be the alternative to Pakistan derives additional support. It is true that in the month of April 1940, a conference of Muslims was held in Delhi under the grandiloquent name of the Azad Muslim Conference. The Muslims who met in the Azad Conference were those who were opposed to the Muslim League as well as to the nationalist Muslims. They were opposed to the Muslim League firstly because of their hostility to Pakistan, and secondly because they did not want to depend upon the British government for the protection of their rights. Reference to Mufti Kifayat Ullah, a prominent member of the conference, in the course of his speech is reported to have said, inverted comma begins, they had to demonstrate that they were not behind any other community in the fight for freedom. He wished to declare in clear terms that they did not rely on the British government for the protection of their rights. They would themselves chalk out the safeguards necessary for the protection of their religious rights and would fight out any party, however powerful, that would refuse to accept those safeguards, as they would fight the government for freedom. Inverted comma closed. Prolonged cheers. Hindustan Times, April 30, 1940. Reference over. They were also opposed to the nationalist Musalmans, that is, Congressites, out and out, because they were accused of indifference to the cultural and religious rights of the Muslims. Reference to see the speeches of Maulana Hafizul Rahman and Dr. K. M. Ashraf in the same issue of the Hindustan Times. Reference over. With all this, the Azad Muslim Conference was hailed by the Hindus as a conference of friends. But the resolutions passed by the conference leave very little to choose between it and the League. Among the resolutions passed by the Azad Muslim Conference, these three bear directly upon the issue in question. The first of these runs as such, inverted comma begins, this conference, representative of Indian Muslims who desire to secure the fullest freedom of the country, consisting of delegates and representatives of every province, after having given its fullest and most careful consideration to all the vital questions affecting the interest of the Muslim community and the country as a whole, declares this: India will have geographical and political boundaries of an individual, whole, and as such is the common homeland of all the citizens, irrespective of race or religion, who are joint owners of its resources. All nooks and corners of the country are hearths and homes of Muslims who cherish the historic eminence of their religion and culture, which are dearer to them than their lives. From the national point of view, every Muslim is an Indian. The common rights of all residents of the country and their responsibilities in every walk of life and in every sphere of human activity are the same. The Indian Muslim, by virtue of these rights and responsibilities, is unquestionable an Indian national, and in every part of the country is entitled to equal privileges with that of every Indian national in every sphere of governmental, economic, and other national activities and in public services. For that very reason, Muslims own equal responsibilities with other Indians for striving and making sacrifices to achieve the country's independence. This is a self-evident proposition, the truth of which no right-thinking Muslim will question. This conference declares unequivocally and with all emphasis at its command that the goal of Indian Muslim is complete independence along with protection of their religion and communal rights, and that they are anxious to attain this goal as early as possible. Inspired by this aim, they have in the past made great sacrifices and are ever ready to make greater sacrifices. The conference unreservedly and strongly repudiates the baseless charge levelled against Indian Muslims by the agents of British imperialism and others that they are an obstacle in the path of Indian freedom, and emphatically declares that the Muslims are fully alive to their responsibilities and consider it inconsistent with their traditions and derogatory to their honor to lag behind others in the struggle for independence. Inverted comma, closed, reference over. By this resolution, they repudiate the scheme of Pakistan. Their second resolution was in these terms. Inverted comma begins, this is the considered view of this conference, that only that constitution for the future government of India would be acceptable to the people of India, which is framed by the Indians themselves, elected by means of adult franchise. The constitution should fully safeguard all the legitimate interests of the Muslims in accordance with the recommendations of the Muslim members of the Constituent Assembly. The representatives of other communities or of an outside power would have no right to interfere in the determination of these safeguards. Inverted comma closed. By this resolution, the conference asserted that the safeguards for the Muslims must be determined by the Muslims alone. Their third resolution was, inverted comma begins, whereas in the future constitution of India, it would be essential in order to ensure stability of government and preservation of security that every citizen and community should feel satisfied. This conference considers it necessary that a scheme of safeguards as regards vital matters mentioned below should be prepared to the satisfaction of the Muslims. This conference appoints a board consisting of 27 persons. This board, after the fullest investigation, consultation and consideration, shall make its recommendations for submission to the next session of this conference, so that the conference may utilize the recommendations as a means of securing a permanent national settlement of the communal question. This recommendation should be submitted within 2 months. The matters referred to the board are 1. The protection of Muslim culture, personal law and religious rights. 2. Political rights of Muslims and their protection. 3. The formation of future Constitution of India to be non-unitary and federal, with absolutely essential and unavoidable powers for the federal government. The provision of safeguards for the economic, social and cultural rights of Muslims and for their share in public services. The board will be empowered to fill up any vacancy in a suitable manner. The board will have the right to co-opt other members. It will be empowered also to consult other Muslim bodies, and if it considers necessary, any responsible organization in the country. The 27 members of the board will be nominated by the President. The quorum for the meeting will be 9. Since the safeguards of the communal rights of different communities will be determined in the Constituent Assembly referred to in the resolution which this conference has passed, this conference considers it necessary to declare that Muslim members of this constituent will be elected by Muslims themselves. Inverted comma closed, reference over. We must await the report. Reference to. This report has not appeared even now. Reference over. Of this board to know what safeguards the Azad Muslim Conference will devise for the safety and protection of Muslims, but there appears no reason to hope that they will not be in favor of what I have guessed to be the likely alternative for Pakistan. It cannot be overlooked that the Azad Muslim Conference was a body of Muslims who were not only opposed to the Muslim League, but were equally opposed to the nationalist Muslims. There is therefore no ground to trust that they will be more merciful to the Hindus than the League has been or will be. Supposing my guess turns out to be correct, it would be interesting to know what the Hindus will have to say in reply. Should they prefer such an alternative to Pakistan? Or should they rather prefer Pakistan to such an alternative? Those are questions which I must leave the Hindus and their leaders to answer. All I would like to say in this connection is that the Hindus, before determining their attitude towards this question, should note certain important considerations. In particular, they should note that there is a difference between mat politic and gravamen politic. Reference to mat politic means power politics and gravamen politic means in which the main strategy is to gain power by manufacturing grievances. That there is a difference between communitas communitatum and a nation of nations. That there is a difference between safeguards to allay apprehensions of the weak and contrivances to satisfy the ambition for power of the strong. That there is a difference between providing safeguards and handing over the country. Further, they should also note that what may with safety be conceded to government politic may not be conceded to mat politic. What may be conceded with safety to a community may not be conceded to a nation, and what may be conceded with safety to the weak, to be used by it as a weapon of defense, may not be conceded to the strong, who may use it as a weapon of attack. These are important considerations, and if the Hindus overlook them, they will do so at their peril, for the Muslim alternative is really a frightful and dangerous alternative. Chapter 9. Lessons from Abroad. Hindus who will not yield to the demand of the Muslims for the division of India into Pakistan and Hindustan, and would insist upon maintaining the geographical unity of India without counting the cost, will do well to study the fate that has befallen other countries which, like India, harbored many nations and sought to harmonize them. It is not necessary to review the history of all such countries. It is enough to recount here the story of two, Turkey and Czechoslovakia. 1. To begin with Turkey, the emergence of the Turks in history was due to the fact that they were driven away by the Mongols from their home in Central Asia, somewhere between 1230 to 40 AD, which led them to settle in northwest Anatolia. Their career as the builders of the Turkish Empire began in 1326 with the conquest of Brusa. In 1360-61, they conquered Thrace from the Aegean to the Black Sea. In 1361-62, the Byzantine government of Constantinople accepted their supremacy. In 1369, Bulgaria followed suit. In 1371-72, Macedonia was conquered. In 1373, Constantinople definitely accepted Ottoman sovereignty. In 1389, Servia was conquered. In 1430, Salonika. In 1453, Constantinople. In 1461, Trebizond. In 1465, Kuraman. And in 1475, Kaffa and Tana were annexed. After a short lull, they conquered Mosul in 1514, Syria, Egypt, the Hijaz and the Yemen in 1516-17, and Belgrade in 1521. This was followed in 1526 by victory over the Hungarians at Mohkaz. In 1554 took place the first conquest of Baghdad, and in 1639 the second conquest of Baghdad. Twice they laid siege to Vienna, first in 1529 and again in 1683, with a view to extend their conquest beyond. But on both occasions they were repulsed, with the result that their expansion in Europe was completely checked forever. Still, the countries they conquered between 1326 and 1683 formed a vast empire. A few of these territories the Turks had lost to their enemies thereafter, but taking the extent of the Turkish Empire as it stood in 1789 on the eve of the French Revolution, it comprised 1. The Balkans, south of the Danube, 2. Asia Minor, the Levant and the neighboring islands, that is Cyprus, 3. Syria and Palestine, 4. Egypt, and 5. North Africa from Egypt to Morocco. The tale of the disruption of the Turkish Empire is easily told. The first to break away de facto, if not de jure, was Egypt in 1769. The next were the Christians in the Balkans. Bessarabia was taken by Russia in 1812 after a war with Turkey. In 1812, Serbia rebelled with the aid of Russia, and the Turks were obliged to place Serbia under a separate government. In 1829, similar concessions were granted to two other Danubian provinces, Moldavia and Wallachia. As a result of the Greek War of Independence, which lasted between 1822 to 29, Greece was completely freed from the Turkish rule, and the Greek independence was recognized by the powers in 1832. Between 1875 to 77, there was turmoil amongst the Balkans. There was a revolt in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the Bulgarians resorted to atrocities against the Turks, to which the Turks replied with atrocities in equal measure. As a result, Serbia and Montenegro declared war on Turkey, and so did Russia. By the Treaty of Berlin, Bulgaria was given self-government under Turkey, and eastern Romania was to be ruled by Turkey under a Christian governor. Russia gained Kars and Batum. Dobruja was given to Romania. Bosnia and Herzegovina were assigned to Austria for administration, and England occupied Cyprus. In 1881, Greece gained Thessaly, and France occupied Tunis. In 1885, Bulgaria and eastern Romania were united into one state. The story of the growth and decline of the Turkish Empire up to 1906 has been very graphically described by Mr. Lane Poulet in these words. Reference to Turkey, page 363 to 64. Inverted comma begins. In its old extent, when the Porte ruled not merely the narrow territory now called Turkey in Europe, but Greece, Bulgaria and eastern Romania, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, with the Crimea and a portion of southern Russia, Egypt, Syria, Tripoli, Tunis, Algiers, and numerous islands in the Mediterranean, not counting the vast but mainly desert tract of Arabia, the total population at the present time would be over 50 millions, or nearly twice that of Europe without Russia. One by one, her provinces have been taken away. Algiers and Tunis have been incorporated with France, and this 175,000 square miles and 5 million inhabitants have transferred their allegiance. Egypt is practically independent, and this means a loss of 5 lakh miles and over 6 millions of inhabitants. Asiatic Turkey alone has suffered comparatively little diminution. This forms the bulk of her present dominions and comprises about 6,80,000 square miles and over 16 million of population. In Europe, her losses have been almost as severe as in Africa, where Tripoli alone remains to her. Serbia and Bosnia are administered by Austria, and thereby nearly 40,000 miles and 3.5 millions of people have become Austrian subjects. Wallachia and Moldavia are united in the independent kingdom of Romania, diminishing the extent of Turkey by 46,000 miles and over 5 millions of inhabitants. Bulgaria is a dependent state over which the Porte has no real control, and eastern Romania has lately de facto become part of Bulgaria, and the two contain nearly 40,000 square miles and 3 millions of inhabitants. The Kingdom of Greece, with its 250,000 miles and 2 million population, has long been separated from its parent. In Europe, where the Turkish territory once extended to 230,000 miles, with a population of nearly 20 millions, it now reaches only the total of 66,000 miles and a population of 4.5 millions. It has lost nearly 3/4 of its land and about the same proportion of its people. Inverted comma, closed. Reference over. Such was the condition of Turkey in 1907. What has befallen her since then is unfortunately the worst part of her story. In 1908, taking advantage of the revolution brought about by the Young Turks, Austria annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Bulgaria declared her independence. In 1911, Italy took possession of Tripoli, and in 1912, France occupied Morocco. Encouraged by the successful attack of Italy in 1912, Bulgaria, Greece, Serbia, and Montenegro formed themselves into a Balkan League and declared war on Turkey. In this war, known as the First Balkan War, Turkey was completely defeated. By the Treaty of London, 1913, the Turkish territory in Europe was reduced to a narrow strip round Constantinople, but the treaty could not take effect because the victors could not agree on the distribution of the spoils of victory. In 1913, Bulgaria declared war on the rest of the Balkan League, and Romania declared war on Bulgaria in the hope of extending her territory. Turkey also did the same. By the Treaty of Bucharest, 1913, which ended the Second Balkan War, Turkey recovered Adrianople and got Thrace from Bulgaria. Serbia obtained northern Macedonia, and Greece obtained southern Macedonia, including Salonika, while Montenegro enlarged her territory at the expense of Turkey. By 1914, when the Great European War came on, the Balkans had won their independence from Turkey, and the area in Europe that remained under the Turkish Empire was indeed a very small area round about Constantinople and her possessions in Asia. So far as the African continent is concerned, the Sultan's power over Egypt and the rest of North Africa was only nominal, for the European powers had established real control therein. In the Great War of 1914, the overthrow of Turkey was complete. All the provinces from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf were overrun, and the great cities of Baghdad, Jerusalem, Damascus, and Aleppo were captured. In Europe, the Allied troops occupied Constantinople. The Treaty of Sèvres, which brought the war with Turkey to a close, sought to deprive her of all her outlying provinces and even of the fertile plains of Asia Minor. Greek claim for territory was generously allowed at the expense of Turkey in Macedonia, Thrace, and Asia Minor, and Italy was to receive Adelia and a large tract in the south. Turkey was to be deprived of all her Arab provinces in Asia, Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Hejaz, and Najd. There was left to Turkey only the capital, Constantinople, and separated from this city by a neutral zone of the straits, part of the barren plateau of Anatolia. The treaty, though accepted by the Sultan, was fiercely attacked by the nationalist party under Kamal Pasha. When the Greeks advanced to occupy their new territory, they were attacked and decisively beaten. At the end of the war with Greece, which went on from 1920 to 1922, the Turks had reoccupied Smyrna. As the Allies were not prepared to send armies to help the Greeks, they were forced to come to terms with the nationalist Turks. At the conference at Mudiania, the Greeks agreed to revise the terms of the Treaty of Sèvres, which was done by the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, which granted the demands of Turkey except in western Thrace. The rest of the Treaty of Sèvres was accepted by the Turks, which meant the loss of her Arab provinces in Asia. Before the War of 1914, Turkey had lost all her provinces in Europe. After the war, she lost her provinces in Asia. As a result of the dismemberment of the old Turkish Empire, what now remains of it is the small state called the Republic of Turkey, with an area which is a minute fraction of the old empire. Reference: the area of Turkey is 2,94,492 square miles, exclusive of 3,708 square miles of lakes and swamps. The area of Turkey in Europe is only 9,257 square miles. Reference over. 2. Take the case of Czechoslovakia. It is the creation of the Treaty of Trianon, which followed the European War of 1914, None of the peace treaties was more drastic in its terms than the Treaty of Trianon. Says Professor McCartney, inverted comma begins, by it, Hungary was not so much mutilated as dismembered. Even if we exclude Croatia, Slovenia, which had stood only in a federal relationship to the other lands of the Holy Crown, although one of 800 years standing, Hungary proper was reduced to less than one-third, that is 32.6% of her pre-war area, and a little over two-fifths, that is 41.6% of her population. Territories and peoples, formerly Hungarian, were distributed among no less than 7 states. Inverted comma closed. Of these states, there was one which did not exist before. It was a new creation. That was the state of Czechoslovakia. The area of the Republic of Czechoslovakia was 54,244 square miles, and the population was about 1,36,13,172. It included the territories formerly known as Bohemia, Moravia, Slovakia, and Ruthenia. It was a composite state which included in its bosom 3 principal nationalities: 1. Czechs, occupying Bohemia and Moravia; 2. Slovaks, occupying Slovakia; and 3. Ruthenians in occupation of Ruthenia. Czechoslovakia proved to be a very short-lived state. It lived exactly for 2 decades. On the 15th March 1939, it perished, or rather was destroyed, as an independent state. It became a protectorate of Germany. The circumstances attending its expiry were of a very bewildering nature. Her death was brought about by the very powers which had given it birth. By signing the Munich Pact on 30th September 1938, of which the protectorate was an inevitable consequence, Great Britain, France, and Italy assisted Germany, their former enemy of the Great War, to conquer Czechoslovakia, their former ally. All the work of the Czechs of the past century to gain freedom was wiped off. They were once more to be the slaves of their former German overlords. 3. What are the reasons for the disruption of Turkey? Lord Eversley, in his Turkish Empire, reference to, see abridgment by Sheikh Abdul Rashid, reference over, has attempted to give reasons for the decay of Turkey, some internal, some external. Among the internal causes, there were 2. First, the degeneracy of the Ottoman dynasty. The supreme power fell into the hands either of the wazirs of the sultans, or more often in the hands of women of the harem of the sultan. The harem was always in antagonism to the official administration of the Porte, which ostensibly carried on the administration of the state under the direction of the sultan. The officials of every degree, from the highest to the lowest, were interested in the sale of all offices, civil and military, to the highest bidders. For securing their object, they found it expedient to bribe the inmates of the harem and thereby win the assent of the sultans. The harem thus became the center from which corruption spread throughout the Turkish Empire, and which was one of the main causes of its decay. The second main cause of the decadence of the Turkish Empire was the deterioration of its armies due to 2 causes. During the last 300 years, the army had lost the elan and the daring by which the Ottomans won their many victories in the early period of their career. The loss of this elan and daring by the Turkish army was due to the composition of the army, recruitment to which was restricted to Turks and Arabs, and also to the diminution of opportunities of plunder and the hope of acquiring lands for distribution among the soldiers as an incentive to victory and valor in the latter period, when the empire was on the defensive, and it was no longer a question of making fresh conquests, but of retaining what had already been won. Among the external causes of the disruption of Turkey, the chief one is said to be the rapacity of the European nations. But this view omits to take note of the true cause. The true and the principal cause of the disruption of Turkey was the growth of the spirit of nationalism among its subject peoples. The Greek revolt, the revolts of the Serbs, Bulgarians, and other Balkans against the Turkish authority were no doubt represented as a conflict between Christianity and Islam. That is one way of looking at it, but only a superficial way. These revolts were simply the manifestations of the spirit of nationalism by which they were generated. These revolts, no doubt, had for their immediate causes Turkish misrule, Christian antipathy to Islam, and the machinations of European nations, but this does not explain the real force which motivated them. The real motive force was the spirit of nationalism, and the revolts were only a manifestation of this inner urge brought on by it. That it was nationalism which had brought about the disruption of Turkey is proved by the revolt of the Arabs in the last war and their will to be independent. Here there was no conflict between Islam and Christianity, nor was the relationship between the two that of the oppressor and the oppressed. Yet the Arab claimed to be freed from the Turkish Empire. Why? Because he was moved by Arab nationalism and preferred to be an Arab nationalist to being a Turkish subject. What is the cause of the destruction of Czechoslovakia? The general impression is that it was the result of German aggression. To some extent, that is true, but it is not the whole truth. If Germany was the only enemy of Czechoslovakia, all that she would have lost was the fringe of her borderland, which was inhabited by the Sudeten Germans. German aggression need have cost her nothing more. Really speaking, the destruction of Czechoslovakia was brought about by an enemy within her own borders. That enemy was the intransigent nationalism of the Slovaks, who were out to break up the unity of the state and secure the independence of Slovakia. The union of the Slovaks with the Czechs as units of a single state was based upon certain assumptions. First, the two were believed to be so closely akin as to be one people, and that the Slovaks were only a branch of Czechoslovaks. Second, the two spoke a single Czechoslovak language. Third, there was no separate Slovak national consciousness. Nobody examined these assumptions at the time because the Slovaks themselves desired this union, expressing their wish in 1918 by formal declaration of their representatives at the peace conference. This was a superficial and hasty view of the matter. As Professor McCartney points out, reference to C.A. McCartney, Hungary and Her Successors, Oxford, 1937, page 136. Inverted comma begins, the central political fact which emerges from the consideration of this history of the relations between the Czechs and Slovaks for the purposes of the present age is the final crystallization of a Slovak national consciousness. The genuine and uncompromising believers in a single, indivisible Czechoslovak language and people were certainly never so large, at least in Slovakia, as they were made to appear. Today, they have dwindled to a mere handful under the influence of actual experience of the considerable differences which exist between the Czechs and the Slovaks. At present, Slovak is in practice recognized by the Czechs themselves as the official language of Slovakia. The political and national resistance has been no less tenacious, and today the name of Czechoslovakia is practically confined to official documents and to literature issued for the benefit of foreigners. During many weeks in the country, I only remember hearing one person use the term for herself. This was a half-German, half-Hungarian girl who used it in a purely political sense, meaning that she thought irredentism futile. No Czech and no Slovak feels or calls himself, when speaking naturally, anything but a Czech or a Slovak, as the case may be, inverted comma, closed. This national consciousness of the Slovaks, which was always alive, began to burst forth on seeing that the Sudeten Germans had made certain demands on Czechoslovakia for autonomy. The Germans sought to achieve their objective by the application of gangster morality to international politics, saying, inverted comma begins, "Give us what we ask, or we shall burst up your shop," inverted comma closed. The Slovaks followed suit by making their demands for autonomy, but with a different face. They did not resort to gangster methods, but modulated their demands to autonomy only. They had eschewed all idea of independence, and in the proclamation issued on October 8 by Dr. Tiso, the leading man in the autonomist movement in Slovakia, it was said, inverted comma begins, "We shall proceed in the spirit of our motto, for God and the nation, in a Christian and national spirit," inverted comma closed. Believing in their bona fides and desiring to give no room to the gravamen politic, of which the Slovaks were making full use to disturb the friendly relations between the Czechs and the Slovaks, the National Assembly in Prague passed an act in November 1938, immediately after the Munich Pact, called the Constitutional Act on the Autonomy of Slovakia. Its provisions were of a far-reaching character. There was to be a separate parliament for Slovakia, and this parliament was to decide the constitution of Slovakia within the framework of the legal system of the Czechoslovak Republic. An alteration in the territory of Slovakia was to be with the consent of the two-third majority in the Slovak parliament. The consent of the Slovak parliament was made necessary for international treaties which exclusively concerned Slovakia. Officials of the central state administration in Slovakia were to be primarily Slovaks. Proportional representation of Slovakia was guaranteed in all central institutions, councils, commissions, and other organizations. Similarly, Slovakia was to be proportionally represented on all international organizations in which the Czechoslovak Republic was called upon to participate. Slovak soldiers in peacetime were to be stationed in Slovakia as far as possible. As far as legislative authority was concerned, all subjects which were strictly of common concern were assigned to the Parliament of Czechoslovakia. By way of guaranteeing these rights to the Slovaks, the Constitution Act provided that the decision of the National Assembly to make constitutional changes shall be valid only if the majority constitutionally required for such changes includes also a proportionate majority of the members of the National Assembly elected in Slovakia. Similarly, the election of the President of the Republic required the consent not merely of the constitutionally determined majority of the members of the Parliament, but also of a proportionate majority of the Slovak members. Further, to emphasize that the central government must enjoy the confidence of the Slovaks, it was provided by the Constitution that 1/3 of the Slovak members of Parliament may propose a motion of no confidence. These constitutional changes introduced, much against the will of the Czechs, a hyphen between the Czechs and the Slovaks, which did not exist before. But it was done in the hope that once the relatively minor quarrels between the two were got out of the way, the very nationalism of the Slovaks was more likely to bring them closer to the Czechs than otherwise. With the constitutional changes guaranteeing an independent status to Slovakia, and the fact that the status so guaranteed could not be changed without the consent of the Slovaks themselves, there was no question of the Slovaks ever losing their national identity through submergence by the Czechs. The autonomy introduced by the hyphen separated the cultural waters and saved the Slovaks from losing their color. The first Slovak parliament elected under the new constitution was opened on January 18, 1939, and Dr. Martin Sokol, the president of the parliament, declared, inverted comma begins, the period of the Slovak struggle for freedom is ended. Now begins the period of national rebirth, inverted comma closed. Other speeches made on the occasion indicated that now that Slovakia had its autonomy, the Slovaks would never feel animosity towards the Czechs, and that both would loyally abide by the Czechoslovak state. Not even a month elapsed since the inauguration of the Slovak parliament before the Slovak politicians began their battle against the hyphen and for complete separation. They made excited speeches in which they attacked the Czechs, talked about Czech oppression, and demanded a completely independent Slovakia. By the beginning of March, the various forms of separatism in Slovakia were seriously threatening the integrity of the Czechoslovak state. On March 9, it was learned that Tiso, the Slovak premier, had decided to proclaim the independence of Slovakia. On the 10th, in anticipation of such an act, troops were moved in Slovakia, and Tiso, the prime minister, was dismissed along with other Slovak ministers by the President of the Republic, Dr. Hacha. On the next day, Tiso, supposed to be under police supervision, telephoned to Berlin and asked for help. On Monday, Tiso and Hitler met and had an hour-and-a-half talk in Berlin. Immediately after the talk with Hitler, Tiso got on the phone to Prague and passed on the German orders. They were 1. All Czech troops to be withdrawn from Slovakia. 2. Slovakia to be an independent state under German protection. 3. The Slovak parliament to be summoned by President Hacha to hear the proclamation of independence. There was nothing that President Hacha and the Prague government could do except say yes, for they knew very well that dozens of divisions of German troops were massed around the defenseless frontiers of Czechoslovakia, ready to march in at any moment if the demands made by Germany in the interest of and at the instance of Slovakia were refused. Thus ended the new state of Czechoslovakia. 4. What is the lesson to be drawn from the story of these two countries? There is some difference as to how the matter should be put. Mr. Sidney Brooks would say that the cause of these wars of disruption is nationalism, which according to him is the enemy of the universal peace. Mr. Norman Angell, on the other hand, would say it is not nationalism but the threat to nationalism which is the cause. To Mr. Robertson, nationalism is an irrational instinct, if not a positive hallucination, and the sooner humanity got rid of it, the better for all. In whatever way the matter is put, and howsoever ardently one may wish for the elimination of nationalism, the lesson to be drawn is quite clear, that nationalism is a fact which can neither be eluded nor denied. Whether one calls it an irrational instinct or positive hallucination, the fact remains that it is a potent force which has a dynamic power to disrupt empires. Whether nationalism is the cause or the threat to nationalism is the cause is a difference of emphasis only. The real thing is to recognize, as does Mr. Toynbee, that nationalism is strong enough to produce war in spite of us. It has terribly proved itself to be no outworn creed, but a vital force to be reckoned with. As was pointed out by him, the right reading of nationalism has become an affair of life and death. It was not only so for Europe, it was so for Turkey. It was so for Czechoslovakia. And what was a question of life and death to them could not but be one of life and death to India. Professor Toynbee pleaded, as was done before him by Guizot, for the recognition of nationality as the necessary foundation of European peace. Could India ignore to recognize this plea? If she does, she will be acting at her peril. That nationalism is a disruptive force is not the only lesson to be learnt from the history of these two countries. Their experience embodies much else of equal, if not of greater significance. What that is will be evident if certain facts are recalled to memory. The Turks were by no means as illiberal as they are painted. They allowed their minorities a large measure of autonomy. The Turks had gone far towards solving the problem of how people of different communities with different social heritages are to live together in harmony when they are geographically intermingled. The Ottoman Empire had accorded, as a matter of course, to the non-Muslim and non-Turkish communities within its frontiers a degree of territorial as well as cultural autonomy which had never been dreamt of in the political philosophy of the West. Ought not the Christian subjects to have been satisfied with this? Say what one may, the nationalism of Christian minorities was not satisfied with this local autonomy. It fought for complete freedom, and in that fight Turkey was slit open. The Turks were bound to the Arabs by the tie of religion. The religious tie of Islam is the strongest known to humanity. No social confederacy can claim to rival the Islamic Brotherhood in point of solidarity. Add to this the fact that while the Turk treated his Christian subjects as his inferior, he acknowledged the Arab as his equal. All non-Muslims were excluded from the Ottoman army, but the Arab soldiers and officers served side by side with Turks and Kurds. The Arab officer class, educated in Turkish school, served in military and civil capacities on the same terms as the Turks. There was no derogating distinction between the Turk and the Arab, and there was nothing to prevent the Arab from rising to the highest rank in the Ottoman services. Not only politically, but even socially, the Arab was treated as his equal by the Turk, and Arabs married Turkish wives, and Turks married Arab wives. Ought not the Arabs to have been satisfied with this Islamic brotherhood of Arabs and Turks based on fraternity, liberty, and equality? Say what one may, the Arabs were not satisfied. Arab nationalism broke the bonds of Islam and fought against his fellow Muslim, the Turk, for its independence. It won, but Turkey was completely dismantled. As to Czechoslovakia, she began with the recognition that both the Czechs and the Slovaks were one people. Within a few years, the Slovaks claimed to be a separate nation. They would not even admit that they were a branch of the same stock as the Czechs. Their nationalism compelled the Czechs to recognize the fact that they were a distinct people. The Czechs sought to pacify the nationalism of the Slovaks by drawing a hyphen as a mark indicating distinctness. In place of Czechoslovakia, they agreed to have Czechoslovakia. But even with the hyphen, the Slovak nationalism remained discontented. The act of autonomy was both a hyphen separating them from the Czechs as well as a link joining them with the Czechs. The hyphen as making separation was welcome to the Slovaks, but as making a link with the Czechs was very irksome to them. The Slovaks accepted the autonomy with its hyphen with great relief and promised to be content and loyal to the state, but evidently this was only a matter of strategy. They did not accept it as an ultimate end. They accepted it because they thought that they could use it as a vantage ground for destroying the hyphen, which was their main aim, and convert autonomy into independence. The nationalism of the Slovaks was not content with a hyphen. It wanted a bar in place of the hyphen. Immediately, the hyphen was introduced. They began their battle to replace the hyphen between the Czechs and the Slovaks by a bar. They did not care what means they should employ. Their nationalism was so wrong-headed and so intense that when they failed, they did not hesitate to call the aid of the Germans. Thus, a deeper study of the disruption of Turkey and Czechoslovakia shows that neither local autonomy nor the bond of religion is sufficient to withstand the force of nationalism once it is set on the go. This is a lesson which the Hindus will do well to grasp. They should ask themselves if the Greek, Balkan and Arab nationalism has blown up the Turkish state, and if Slovak nationalism has caused the dismantling of Czechoslovakia, what is there to prevent Muslim nationalism from disrupting the Indian state? If experience of other countries teaches that this is the inevitable consequence of pent-up nationalism, why not profit by their experience and avoid the catastrophe by agreeing to divide India into Pakistan and Hindustan? Let the Hindus take the warning that if they refuse to divide India into two before they launch on their career as a free people, they will be sailing in those shoal waters in which Turkey, Czechoslovakia and many others have foundered. If they wish to avoid shipwreck in mid-ocean, they must lighten the draught by throwing overboard all superfluous cargo. They will ease the course of their voyage considerably if they, to use the language of Professor Toynbee, reconcile themselves to making jetsam of less cherished and more combustible cargo. 5. Will the Hindus really lose if they agree to divide India into two, Pakistan and Hindustan? With regard to Czechoslovakia, it is instructive to note the real feelings of its government on the loss of their territory caused by the Munich Pact. They were well expressed by the Prime Minister of Czechoslovakia in his message to the people of Czechoslovakia. In it, he said, reference to Alexander Henderson, Eyewitnesses in Czechoslovakia, 1939, page number 229 to 230. Inverted comma begins, citizens and soldiers, I am living through the hardest hour of my life. I am carrying out the most painful task, in comparison with which death would be easy. But precisely because I have fought and because I know under what conditions a war is won, must tell you frankly that the forces opposed to us at this moment compel us to recognize their superior strength and to act accordingly. In Munich, 4 European great powers met and decided to demand of us the acceptance of our new frontiers, according to which the German areas of our state would be taken away. We had the choice between desperate and hopeless defense, which would have meant the sacrifice not only the adult generation but also of women and children, and the acceptance of conditions which in their ruthlessness and because they were imposed by pressure without war have no parallel in history. We desired to make a contribution to peace. We would gladly have made it, but not by any means in the way it has been forced upon us. But we were abandoned and were alone. Deeply moved, all your leaders considered, together with the army and the President of the Republic, all the possibilities which remained. They recognized that in choosing between narrower frontiers and the death of the nation, it was their sacred duty to save the life of our people, so that we may not emerge weakened from these terrible times, and so that we may remain certain that our nation will gather itself together again, as it has done so often in the past. Let us all see that our state re-establishes itself soundly within its new frontiers, and that its population is assured of a new life of peace and fruitful labor. With your help, we shall succeed. We rely upon you, and you have confidence in us. Inverted comma, closed. It is evident that the Czechs refuse to be led by the force of historic sentiment. They were ready to have narrower frontiers and a smaller Czechoslovakia to the ultimate destruction of their people. With regard to Turkey, the prevalent view was the one that was expressed in 1853 by the Tsar Nicholas I during a conversation with British ambassador in St. Petersburg, in which he said, inverted comma begins, "We have on our hand a sick man, a very sick man. He may suddenly die upon our hands," inverted comma closed. From that day, the imminent disease of Turkey, the sick man of Europe, was awaited by all his neighbors. The shedding of the territories was considered as the convulsions of a dying man who is alleged to have breathed his last by affixing his signature to the Treaty of Sevres. Is this really a correct view to take of Turkey in the process of dissolution? It is instructive to note the comments of Arnold Toynbee on this view. Referring to the Tsar's description of Turkey as the sick man who may suddenly die, he says, reference to Arnold Toynbee, Turkey, page 141, inverted comma begins, in this second and more sensational part of his diagnosis, Tsar Nicholas went astray because he did not understand the nature of the symptoms. If a person totally ignorant of natural history stumbled upon a snake in the course of shedding its skin, he would pronounce dogmatically that the creature could not possibly recover. He could point out that when a man or other mammal has the misfortune to lose his skin, he is never known to survive. Yet, while it is perfectly true that the leopard cannot change his spots, nor the Ethiopian his skin, a wider study would have informed our amateur naturalist that a snake can do both, and does both habitually. Doubtless, even for the snake, the process is awkward and uncomfortable. He becomes temporarily torpid, and in this condition he is dangerously at the mercy of his enemies. Yet, if he escapes the kites and crows until his metamorphosis is complete, he not only recovers his health, but renews his youth with the replacement of his mortal coils. This is the recent experience of the Turk, and molting snake is better simile than sick man for a description of his distemper, inverted comma closed. In this view, the loss of her possessions by Turkey is the removal of anomalous excrescence and the gain of a new skin. Turkey is certainly homogeneous and has no fear of any disruption from within. The Muslim areas are an anomalous excrescence on Hindustan, and Hindustan is an anomalous excrescence on them. Tied together, they will make India the sick man of Asia. Welded together, they will make India a heterogeneous unit. If Pakistan has the demerit of cutting away parts of India, it has also the merit of introducing harmony in place of conflict. Severed into two, each becomes a more homogeneous unit. The homogeneity of the two areas is obvious enough. Each has a cultural unity, each has a religious unity. Pakistan has a linguistic unity. If there is no such unity in Hindustan, it is possible to have it without any controversy as to whether the common language should be Hindustani, Hindi, or Urdu. Separated, each can become a strong and well-knit state. India needs a strong central government, but it cannot have it so long as Pakistan remains a part of India. Compare the structure of the federal government as embodied in the Government of India Act 1935, and it will be found that the central government as constituted under it is an effete, ramshackle thing with very little life in it. Reference: for further light on this topic, see my tract on Federation versus Freedom. Reference over. As has already been pointed out, This weakening of the central government is brought about by the desire to placate the Muslim provinces who wish to be independent of the authority of the central government on the ground that the central government is bound to be predominantly Hindu in character and composition. When Pakistan comes into being, these considerations can have no force. Hindustan can then have a strong central government and a homogeneous population, which are necessary elements for the stability of the state, and neither of which will be secured unless there is severance of Pakistan from Hindustan.